The world of Nostramo knew no sunlight. Locked in perpetual darkness by some ancient stellar phenomenon, this hive world existed as a monument to human misery, where the only illumination came from the sickly glow of industrial furnaces and the flickering neon of underhive settlements. The planet's eternal night had bred a population as twisted as their environment, a society where murder, extortion, and exploitation formed the foundation of daily existence. The aristocratic families who ruled from their spires extracted wealth from the adamantium mines that honeycombed the planet's crust, while the masses below survived through predation and brutality. Into this lightless hell, one of the Emperor's sons fell from the heavens. Konrad Curze arrived on Nostramo as an infant, his gestation pod having been scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods during their theft of the Primarchs from the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra. Unlike some of his brothers who found themselves adopted by noble families or raised by communities, Curze's pod crashed into the hive city of Nostramo Quintus, and the infant Primarch crawled from the wreckage into the darkest depths of the Underhive. He grew alone, feral and savage, feeding on whatever he could kill in the perpetual gloom. The darkness that surrounded him seeped into his soul, and with it came visions, terrible prophetic nightmares of death, betrayal, and an Imperium drowning in its own blood. As Curze matured with the unnatural speed of a Primarch, his superhuman intellect began to comprehend the cesspit of human degradation around him. The visions that plagued his sleep showed him not just distant futures, but the crimes being committed in the present across Nostramo Quintus. He witnessed every murder, every violation, every act of cruelty through his prescient sight, and something within him snapped. The feral child became something far more terrifying, a judge and executioner, a creature of absolute and merciless justice. He emerged from the depths as a pale, gaunt figure with eyes like chips of obsidian, and he began to hunt. The criminals of Nostramo Quintus died in ways designed to maximize terror. Curze did not simply kill, he made examples. Bodies appeared flayed and hung from the sides of hab blocks. Gang leaders were found disemboweled, their entrails arranged in patterns that spelled out their crimes. Corrupt enforcers disappeared, only to reappear days later as sculptures of meat and bone displayed in public squares. Each murder was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a message written in blood and viscera. The population of Nostramo Quintus learned a simple equation: commit a crime, and the Night Haunter would come for you. The name spread like a plague of fear through the Underhive, then up through the mid-levels, and eventually into the spires themselves. Within a handful of years, the impossible occurred. Crime on Nostramo Quintus ceased almost entirely. The ruling families, initially amused by the vigilantes' attacks on the lower classes, found their own corruption targeted with equal savagery. Curze cared nothing for social hierarchy. A noble who exploited workers died just as messily as a ganger who murdered for sport. The transformation spread beyond the single hive city as Curze expanded his campaign across the entire planet. Nostramo became a world ruled by terror, where the population walked in constant fear of shadows and the judgment they might bring. Parents threatened misbehaving children with the Night Haunter's attention. Workers arrived punctually and performed their duties without complaint, knowing that sabotage or theft meant a visit in the darkness. The aristocracy, stripped of their ability to exploit without consequence, maintained order through the same fear that gripped everyone else. This was the world the Emperor found when his Great Crusade reached the Nostramo system. The Master of Mankind recognized his son immediately, despite the darkness that clung to Curze like a second skin. The meeting between father and son remains sparsely documented, but what is known suggests that Curze accepted his role without the resistance some of his brothers displayed. Perhaps he saw in the Emperor's vision of a unified humanity the ultimate expression of order through strength. Perhaps his visions showed him that refusal was pointless. Regardless, Konrad Curze took command of the 8th Legion and began the process of transforming them into an extension of his brutal philosophy. The 8th Legion before their Primarch's discovery had been a formation quite different from what they would become. Recruited from Terran stock, these original legionaries had served with distinction during the early decades of the Great Crusade. Their methods were harsh compared to some legions, but they remained within the bounds of the Emperor's vision, conquerors who brought worlds into compliance through military superiority and the threat of overwhelming force. They specialized in shock assaults and rapid strikes, using fear as a tactical weapon rather than an end unto itself. The Terran veterans understood that terror was a tool to break enemy morale and reduce casualties on both sides, shortening campaigns that might otherwise drag on for years. The integration of Nostramo recruits changed everything. Curze did not simply draw upon the reformed population of his homeworld. He specifically recruited from those who remembered the old ways, the criminals and gang members who understood violence as a language and survival as an art. These were men who had lived in Nostramo's darkness before Curze's reign of terror, who had committed acts that would have earned them his judgment had they not been useful to his legion. They brought with them the casual brutality of the Underhive, the psychological cruelty of gang warfare, and an intimate understanding of how to break human beings through fear. The Terran veterans watched as their legion's character shifted beneath the weight of Nostramo numbers. The new recruits outnumbered the original legionaries within a few decades of recruitment, and with them came the methods of Nostramo Quintus. Where the Terrans had used fear tactically, the Nostramans reveled in it. They skinned prisoners alive and broadcast their screams across Vox channels. They decorated their armor with flayed faces and carved bones into decorative totems. They hunted enemy commanders through the corridors of their own fortresses, leaving trails of butchered bodyguards to announce their approach. The 8th Legion became the Night Lords, and their reputation began to precede them across the expanding Imperium. Curze encouraged this transformation, seeing in his legion's methods the same philosophy that had brought order to his homeworld. Why waste years in protracted campaigns when a single act of calculated atrocity could bring entire systems into compliance without further bloodshed? The Night Lords began to specialize in targeting civilian populations, military leadership, and infrastructure simultaneously. They would strike at a world's command structure, while simultaneously broadcasting footage of torture and execution to the general population. Planetary governors who witnessed the fate of their predecessors surrendered rather than face the Night Haunter's judgment. Rebellious systems capitulated when they learned the Night Lords were en route to their worlds. The other legions viewed these methods with varying degrees of distaste. The Imperial Fists and Ultramarines found the Night Lords' tactics dishonorable and excessive. The World Eaters, ironically, considered them cowardly. Real warriors met their enemies face to face rather than terrorizing civilians. Even legions like the Iron Warriors, who had no qualms about brutality when necessary, questioned whether the Night Lords' approach served the Emperor's vision or simply satisfied their Primarch's dark impulses. Curze dismissed such criticism with cold logic. His legion brought worlds into compliance faster and with fewer casualties than most of their brother legions. The mathematics of conquest favored terror over honor, yet something was already rotting at the Night Lord's core. The Nostraman recruits had not truly reformed under Curze's rule. They had simply learned to hide their nature until given sanction to unleash it. The criminals and killers who filled the legion's ranks found in the Great Crusade an outlet for their darkest impulses, all sanctioned by the Imperium they ostensibly served. They were no longer punished for their brutality. They were rewarded with new worlds to terrorize and new populations to torment. The line between justice and sadism blurred, then disappeared entirely for many within the Legion's ranks. The Primarch who commanded the Night Lords existed as two entities occupying the same superhuman body. Konrad Curze, the gene-crafted son of the Emperor, possessed an intellect that could grasp the intricacies of fleet logistics, strategic planning, and the governance of entire star systems. The Night Haunter, the feral creature who had crawled from the wreckage in Nostramo's Underhive, knew only the language of violence and the absolute certainty that humanity deserved nothing but terror and death. Whether these represented truly separate personalities or simply different aspects of one fractured psyche remains a question that even the most learned scholars of the Imperium cannot definitively answer. What is certain is that Curze himself believed in this duality, referring to the Night Haunter as though it were a distinct presence within his mind, an entity that took control during his darkest moments. This split manifested most clearly in how Curze led his legion. At times, he functioned as a brilliant military commander, coordinating campaigns across multiple sectors with the strategic acumen expected of a Primarch. He could analyze enemy fleet dispositions, identify weaknesses in planetary defenses, and orchestrate strikes with surgical precision. His captains during these periods found him demanding but coherent, capable of explaining his tactical reasoning and adjusting strategies based on battlefield developments. Then, without warning, the Night Haunter would emerge. During these episodes, Curze became something far more primal and terrifying. He would personally lead boarding actions, tearing through enemy crews with his bare hands, or descend upon planetary capitals to hunt governors through their own palaces. His orders during these periods focused not on military objectives, but on maximizing terror and suffering, transforming campaigns into exercises in psychological torture. The visions made everything worse. From his earliest memories on Nostramo, Curze had experienced prophetic dreams of such clarity and detail that they felt more real than his waking life. These were not vague premonitions or symbolic warnings. They were perfect glimpses of futures yet to come, shown to him with the inevitability of recorded history. He saw the Horus Heresy before any whisper of treachery had touched the legions. He witnessed the War Master's corruption, the burning of Prospero, the siege of Terra, and the millennia of warfare that would follow the Imperium's fracturing. Most significantly, he saw his own death, murdered by an assassin sent by the Emperor, alone and unmourned in the darkness. These visions did not come as possibilities to be avoided, but as certainties to be endured. The knowledge destroyed any hope Curze might have harbored about his purpose or destiny. He understood that every action he took led inevitably toward the future he had already witnessed. Free will became a cruel joke, a comforting lie that lesser beings told themselves to maintain the illusion of control. If the future was fixed and unchangeable, then his crimes were not crimes at all but necessary steps along a predetermined path. The atrocities he committed, the worlds he terrorized, the innocents he slaughtered, all of it had already happened in the visions that plagued his sleeping hours. This fatalism poisoned every aspect of his existence, transforming him from a potentially noble figure into something twisted and broken. He did not choose to become a monster. He believed he had been created as one, designed by fate or the Emperor or the universe itself to serve as an instrument of terror. The other Primarchs recognized Curze's instability, though few understood its true depth. His relationship with his brothers ranged from cold indifference to outright hostility, colored by his knowledge of what many of them would become. He held particular contempt for Rogel Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, whose unwavering belief in the Imperium's righteousness struck Curze as willful blindness. Dorn embodied everything Curze despised about the Crusades' idealism, the notion that humanity could be uplifted through noble example and steadfast duty. During the few occasions when they interacted, Curze took perverse pleasure in challenging Dorn's certainties, pointing out the hypocrisy inherent in an Imperium built on conquest and forced compliance while claiming to represent enlightenment and progress. Dorn, for his part, viewed Curze with barely concealed disgust, seeing in the Night Haunter the antithesis of everything a Primarch should represent. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children represented a different dynamic entirely. Before the heresy, their interactions remained limited and professional rather than antagonistic. Fulgrim pursued perfection in all things, seeking to elevate humanity through art, culture, and the refinement of the warrior's craft. Curze saw such pursuits as meaningless distractions from the fundamental truth of human nature, that beneath the veneer of civilization, every person was a potential monster, restrained only by fear of consequences. They did not clash because they operated in fundamentally different spheres, Fulgrim seeking to inspire while Curze sought to terrify. The distance between them meant that when Fulgrim fell to chaos, Curze felt vindication rather than betrayal. The pursuit of perfection had revealed itself as just another path to damnation, proving what Curze had always known about the futility of noble aspirations. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, however, became Curze's most significant adversary among his brothers. The two Primarchs shared certain similarities. Both had grown up in darkness, both understood the necessity of ruthless action, both kept secrets from their legions and their father. These parallels made their differences all the more stark. The Lion believed in the Imperium's cause even as he employed methods that other Primarchs found questionable. Curze believed in nothing except the inevitability of humanity's failure. Their conflict erupted into open warfare during the Thrama's Crusade, a 3-year campaign that saw the Night Lords and Dark Angels locked in a brutal struggle for control of the Thrama's sector, while the wider heresy raged across the galaxy. The Thrama's Crusade showcased both Curze's tactical brilliance and his descent into complete madness. He orchestrated ambushes that destroyed entire Dark Angel's fleet elements, used captured prisoners to lure his brother into traps, and turned the sector into a charnel house of destroyed worlds and shattered fleets. The Lion matched him move for move, his own strategic genius preventing Curze from achieving total victory, despite the Night Lord's advantages in mobility and intelligence gathering. The campaign culminated in a series of personal confrontations between the two Primarchs that left both wounded and neither victorious. During one particularly savage encounter, they fought through the corridors of a crippled battle station, trading blows that would have killed lesser beings. The Lion's sword opened wounds across Curze's torso, while Curze's lightning claws carved deep gouges in his brother's armor. Neither could claim victory, and the arrival of reinforcements forced them apart before either could land a killing blow. Their animosity continued long after Thrama's. When they met again later in the Heresy, their confrontations became even more personal and vicious. Curze took perverse pleasure in tormenting the Lion with revelations about the Dark Angel's secrets, knowledge gleaned from his visions and from captured prisoners. The Lion responded with cold fury, his hatred for Curze transcending the political divisions of the heresy to become something deeply personal. Where other Primarchs fought for ideology or ambition, the Lion fought Curze because he recognized in the Night Haunter a fundamental corruption that needed to be excised from the galaxy. Their battles left scars on both that never truly healed, physical and psychological wounds that defined their characters for the remainder of their existence. Curze's philosophy of terror as governance extended far beyond simple tactical expedients. He genuinely believed that fear represented the most honest relationship between ruler and ruled. Every other method of control, faith, loyalty, duty, honor, relied on lies and manipulation. The Imperium promised protection in exchange for compliance, but what was that protection worth when the Imperium itself would burn worlds that refused to submit? The Emperor spoke of enlightenment and progress, while his armies crushed any civilization that rejected his vision of humanity's future. Curze saw through these comfortable fictions to the brutal reality beneath. Power flowed from the barrel of a bolter and the edge of a blade, and any government that pretended otherwise was simply more sophisticated in its deceptions. In Curze's view, his methods possessed a terrible honesty that the Imperium's other enforcers lacked. When the Night Lords arrived at a world, they made no false promises about brotherhood or shared prosperity. They offered a simple choice: submit or suffer. The populations they terrorized understood exactly why they obeyed, not because they believed in the Imperium's righteousness, but because they feared the consequences of resistance. This created a more stable compliance than the false loyalty generated by the Ultramarines' civic improvements or the word-bearers' religious fervor. People who obeyed out of fear did not need to believe in anything except the certainty of punishment. They would not rebel when their faith wavered or their idealism faded, because they had never possessed either to begin with. This philosophy made Curze one of the Imperium's most effective instruments of conquest during the early Crusade, even as it made him one of its most disturbing. Worlds that heard the Night Lords were coming surrendered before the first drop pod touched ground. Rebellious systems that had resisted other legions for years capitulated within weeks when Curze's fleet entered their space. The mere threat of the Night Haunter's attention proved sufficient to maintain order across entire subsectors. From a purely strategic perspective, Curze's approach worked exactly as he claimed it would. The problem, which even he recognized in his more lucid moments, was what this method did to those who employed it. The Night Lords were not immune to the corruption inherent in their tactics. Terrorizing populations and committing calculated atrocities required a certain psychological distance from normal human empathy, and maintaining that distance over decades of campaigning transformed the Legion in ways that went beyond simple brutalization. The Nostramo recruits who had always possessed sadistic tendencies found themselves encouraged and rewarded for behaviors that would have earned them execution on any civilized world. The Terran veterans, who had once viewed terror as a tactical tool, gradually lost the ability to distinguish between necessary cruelty and sadistic excess. The Legion's apothecaries noted increased instances of psychological instability, violent outbursts during routine operations, and a disturbing tendency among some battle brothers to extend their brutality beyond enemy combatants to Imperial civilians and even their own mortal auxiliaries. Curze observed this deterioration with a mixture of satisfaction and despair. It proved his theories about human nature. Given permission and opportunity, even the Emperor's finest warriors reverted to monsters. Yet it also demonstrated the futility of his methods. The order he had imposed on Nostramo had lasted only as long as he personally enforced it. Once he left to join the crusade, taking the most violent elements of the population with him as Legion recruits, the world's criminal enterprises had gradually re-emerged. The aristocratic families had found new ways to exploit the masses. The gangs had reformed in the underhives. His reign of terror had changed nothing fundamental about Nostramo's society because it had addressed symptoms rather than causes. Fear alone could not transform human nature, only suppress it temporarily. This realization fed into Curze's growing fatalism and his conviction that the Imperium's entire project was doomed to failure. If even his own Legion, crafted from his genetic material and shaped by his personal leadership, could not maintain discipline without descending into sadism, what hope did baseline humanity have of building a lasting civilization? The visions showed him the answer: none. The Imperium would tear itself apart, the Emperor's dream would die in fire and blood, and the galaxy would drown in eternal warfare. Curze had seen this future with perfect clarity, and every day brought it closer to reality. The Night Lords did not stumble into their reputation as the Imperium's most feared legion through accident or gradual evolution. Konrad Curze deliberately shaped his warriors into instruments of psychological warfare, refining terror from a battlefield expedient into a comprehensive military doctrine. The process began with recruitment and continued through every aspect of training, equipment selection, and operational planning. Where other legions taught their neophytes the principles of honor, duty, or martial excellence, the Night Lords indoctrinated theirs in the science of fear. Instructors drawn from Nostramo's worst elements taught recruits how to identify psychological breaking points, how to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive, and how to transform ordinary military operations into theatrical displays of horror that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Legion's approach to terror tactics operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the strategic level, their reputation alone could bring worlds into compliance without a single shot fired. Intelligence networks seeded throughout the Imperium ensured that stories of Night Lords' atrocities spread far beyond the worlds where they actually occurred. Populations heard about entire hive cities flayed alive, about governors forced to watch their families tortured before their own executions, about populations bombed with the rendered remains of their own military forces. The veracity of these accounts mattered less than their psychological impact. By the time the Night Lord's fleet actually entered a system, the target population had already been softened by months or years of accumulated dread. Operational level terror tactics focused on destroying enemy command structures and breaking military cohesion before conventional combat even began. The Night Lords excelled at infiltration, using their skills at stealth and void warfare to insert small teams onto target worlds weeks or months before the main assault. These advanced elements did not engage in sabotage or intelligence gathering like the infiltrators of other legions. Instead, they hunted. Planetary governors disappeared from their fortified compounds, only to reappear days later in public squares, their bodies arranged in elaborate tableaus that demonstrated exactly how thoroughly their security had failed. Military commanders found their bodyguards murdered in their sleep, the killers leaving behind symbols and messages that promised the commander would be next. Defense Force officers received packages containing the flayed faces of their colleagues, each delivery accompanied by Vox messages detailing when and how the Night Lords would come for them personally. These preliminary operations served a calculated purpose beyond simple intimidation. By the time the main Night Lord's fleet arrived, enemy command structures had often collapsed into paranoia and paralysis. Officers spent more time securing their own safety than coordinating defensive preparations. Soldiers deserted rather than face an enemy that seemed capable of killing anyone, anywhere, regardless of fortifications or security measures. Civilian populations rioted or fled, clogging transportation networks and consuming resources needed for military operations. The Night Lords then struck at targets already weakened by weeks of psychological assault, their actual military operations serving as the final blow against enemies who had already been half defeated by fear. Tactical-level terror operations during actual combat focused on breaking enemy morale through calculated atrocity and the systematic violation of accepted combat norms. The Night Lords did not simply kill enemy soldiers, they made examples of them. Captured defenders were tortured within sight and hearing of their comrades, their screams broadcast across all Vox frequencies. Bodies were mutilated in specific ways designed to communicate messages. Officers received special attention, their corpses displayed prominently to demonstrate the futility of leadership. The Night Lords would sometimes pause their assaults to allow enemy forces to discover what had happened to their captured comrades, the resulting psychological impact worth more than the tactical advantage of maintaining momentum. The equipment and iconography the Legion adopted reinforced their reputation at every opportunity. Lightning claws became their signature weapon, preferred over the power swords and fists common in other legions. These weapons consisted of multiple power-field sheathed blades extending from a gauntlet mount, allowing the wielder to tear through armor and flesh with savage efficiency. The crackling energy fields that surrounded the blades created a distinctive sound and visual signature, a blue-white discharge that illuminated the darkness where Night Lords preferred to fight. More importantly, lightning claws excelled at the kind of close-quarters butchery that characterized the Legion's approach to warfare. They could flay targets alive with surgical precision or reduce them to shredded meat in seconds, depending on the psychological impact desired. The Legion's armor reflected their methods and their homeworld's eternal darkness. Night Lords painted their ceramite in midnight blue, so dark it appeared black in most lighting conditions, decorated with lightning bolt patterns in metallic blue that mimicked the electrical storms that occasionally lit Nostramo's perpetual gloom. These lightning bolts served both as Legion heraldry and as practical camouflage, breaking up the distinctive silhouette of power armor when fighting in the darkness the Night Lords cultivated. The effect made individual warriors difficult to track visually, appearing as fragmentary shapes and flashes of reflected light rather than solid targets. Their helmets became objects of particular dread across the Imperium. Night Lords favored designs that incorporated skull-faced motifs, the eye lenses and breathing grills arranged to create the appearance of a human skull rendered in ceramite and plasteel. These helms integrated sophisticated night vision augmetics that allowed the wearer to operate in complete darkness, turning the Night Lords into apex predators in environments where their enemies stumbled blind. The psychological impact of these skull helms proved as valuable as their tactical utility. Populations already terrified of the Night Lords found their fears amplified when confronted by warriors whose very appearance evoked death itself. The helms transformed individual Astartes from soldiers into walking symbols of mortality, their presence a reminder that death stalked the battlefield in ceramite armor. The Legion decorated their armor and wargear with trophies taken from victims, transforming themselves into mobile monuments to their atrocities. Flayed human skin, carefully preserved through chemical treatment, hung from shoulder guards and backpack mounts. Some warriors wore cloaks fashioned entirely from stitched-together faces, each one representing a kill of particular significance. Skulls and bones adorned almost every surface not critical to the armor's function, femurs lashed to leg plates, finger bones woven into chain decorations, craniums mounted on belt hooks. These decorations served multiple purposes. They intimidated enemies who saw them, demonstrated the wearer's kill count to their brothers, and satisfied the sadistic impulses that drove many Night Lords to seek new and more elaborate ways to display their brutality. Nostramo runes covered much of the Legion's equipment and facilities, a written language that predated Curze's unification of the planet. These angular, harsh symbols carried meanings related to death, darkness, judgment, and fear. Individual warriors inscribed their armor with runes describing their deeds or their personal philosophies of terror. Company and chapter markings incorporated runic elements that identified unit lineages and specializations. The runes served as a constant reminder of the Legion's origins in Nostramo's criminal underworld, a visual language that connected them to their homeworld's darkest traditions, even as they spread across the galaxy. Bat-winged imagery appeared throughout Night Lord's iconography, drawn from the chiropteran predators that hunted in Nostramo's hive cities. These creatures represented the ideal that the Legion aspired to, silent hunters that struck from darkness and disappeared before their prey even realized the danger. Company standards featured stylized bat wings, often clutching skulls or other symbols of death. Some warriors incorporated actual bat wing patterns into their armor decoration, the membranes rendered in paint or etched into ceramite. The imagery reinforced the Legion's identity as creatures of the night, predators who owned the darkness, and used it as a weapon against those who feared it. Certain members of the Legion inherited fragments of their Primarch's curse, experiencing prophetic visions similar to those that plagued Konrad Curze. These battle brothers found themselves tormented by nightmares that showed possible futures with varying degrees of clarity and reliability. Unlike their Primarch's perfect foresight, these visions came fragmentary and symbolic, requiring interpretation and often proving ambiguous in their meaning. The affected warriors experienced these episodes during sleep or meditation, sometimes during the fugue state that accompanied serious wounds. The visions showed deaths yet to come, betrayals waiting to unfold, and glimpses of the dark future that awaited the Legion and the Imperium. The Legion's leadership recognized these psychers, for that is what they were, despite the Night Lord's general disdain for librarians and sanctioned psychers, as valuable assets when properly managed. Warriors who experienced reliable visions received assignments as advisors to company commanders or fleet captains, their insights informing tactical and strategic planning. Others found their visions too fragmentary or disturbing to provide useful intelligence, these unfortunates often descending into madness as the weight of prophetic knowledge destroyed their sanity. The Legion maintained no formal organization for these cursed individuals, no equivalent to the librarius maintained by legions that embraced psychers. Instead, they existed as isolated assets, valued for their occasional insights but feared and shunned by their brothers who recognized the madness that accompanied the gift. The Night Lords developed specific tactical formations and operational procedures designed to maximize Terror's effectiveness. Terror assault units represented the purest expression of this doctrine, specialized squads equipped for maximum shock value and trained to create the greatest possible psychological impact in the shortest time. These units typically consisted of veterans selected for their skill at close quarters combat and their willingness to commit atrocities without hesitation. They deployed ahead of main assault forces, targeting command bunkers, communication centers, and other high-value locations where their presence would create maximum disruption. Terror assault operations followed a consistent pattern refined over decades of campaigning. The squad would infiltrate their target location using stealth, void warfare, or overwhelming speed, depending on circumstances. Once inside, they would secure key personnel, commanders, communications officers, anyone whose torture would serve a tactical purpose. The actual killing began only after the squad established control and prepared to broadcast what followed. Vox systems would be seized and set to transmit across all frequencies, ensuring that every defender in the operational area could hear what happened next. Then the Terror Assault Squad would begin their work. The torture that followed served tactical rather than sadistic purposes, though the distinction meant little to the victims. Screams transmitted across Vox networks broke enemy morale more effectively than any conventional psychological warfare. Defenders hearing their commanders begging for death, listening to the wet sounds of flaying and dismemberment, knowing that the Night Lords were inside their most secure facilities, these experiences shattered unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Soldiers abandoned their posts, officers lost control of their subordinates. Defensive coordination collapsed as individual units focused on their own survival rather than collective resistance. By the time the main Night Lord's assault arrived, the enemy had often already broken. The practice of leaving elaborate crime scenes as warnings became another signature Night Lord's tactic. After securing an objective, they would spend hours or even days arranging the bodies of defenders into specific configurations designed to communicate particular messages. A governor who had resisted compliance might be found seated on his throne, surrounded by the flayed corpses of his advisors, their skins draped over the furniture like decorative fabric. Military commanders could be discovered in their war rooms, their bodies positioned around tactical displays in mockery of staff meetings, their blood used to mark enemy positions on maps and planning tables. These scenes served as warnings to other worlds considering resistance, and as demonstrations of the Night Lord's complete control over the populations they terrorized. The systematic flaying of populations represented the Night Lord's most notorious practice, an atrocity so extreme that even other traitor legions found it excessive. When a world resisted with particular determination, or when Curze decided an example needed to be made, the Night Lords would descend upon population centers and begin the methodical skinning of every inhabitant they could capture. The process was not quick. Trained apothecaries and specialists could keep victims alive for hours or even days while removing their skin in strips. The flayed bodies would then be displayed throughout the conquered territory, hung from buildings, impaled on stakes, or arranged in massive pyramids of flesh that could be seen from orbit. These monuments of meat served multiple purposes within the Night Lord's doctrine of terror. They demonstrated the futility of resistance to populations considering rebellion. They satisfied the sadistic impulses of Legion members who had long since lost any capacity for normal human empathy. They created lasting psychological trauma in survivors who would carry memories of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives, ensuring compliance through the weight of horror rather than mere fear. Most significantly, they announced to the wider Imperium that the Night Lords had claimed another world, their reputation growing with each new atrocity added to an already extensive catalog of war crimes. The 8th Legion's effectiveness as an instrument of compliance became apparent within the first decade of Konrad Curze assuming command. Entire subsectors that had resisted Imperial contact for years suddenly transmitted surrender codes the moment they learned the Night Lords were en route. Planetary governors who had fortified their worlds against the Imperium's advance ordered their defensive fleets to stand down rather than face what the Night Haunter's warriors would do if forced to fight for compliance. The mathematics of terror proved Curze's thesis correct. A single act of calculated atrocity could achieve what months of conventional warfare could not, saving Imperial lives and resources while expanding the Crusade's reach at unprecedented speed. The Cheraut system provided an early demonstration of this principle. 3 inhabited worlds had rejected multiple compliance offers from the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, their combined defensive fleets and fortified positions making conventional assault prohibitively costly. The War Council debated siege strategies and protracted campaigns until Curze volunteered the Night Lords for the operation. His fleet entered the Cheraut system and proceeded directly to the capital world, ignoring the defensive flotillas that scrambled to intercept. The Night Lords broke through orbital defenses through sheer aggression, accepting casualties that other legions would have considered unacceptable to achieve rapid deployment. Within 6 hours of making planetfall, they had seized the planetary governor and his entire administrative apparatus. What followed was broadcast across every communications channel in the system. The Night Lords flayed the governor and his staff alive in the world's primary legislative chamber, the torture lasting for 3 days while the rest of the system watched. Curze himself presided over the proceedings, his gaunt form visible in the transmissions as he explained in precise detail what resistance to Imperial compliance earned. The screams echoed through Vox speakers on every world, in every habitat, aboard every ship. When the governor finally died, the Night Lords moved on to the world's military command structure, then its industrial leadership, then randomly selected portions of the general population. By the end of the first week, the capital world had surrendered unconditionally. The other two worlds in the system transmitted their compliance within hours of witnessing what had happened to their neighbors. The Cherokee compliance became a template for dozens of similar operations across the expanding Imperium. The Night Lords would identify systems where conventional approaches had stalled or where resistance appeared likely to be protracted. They would strike with overwhelming speed at the most heavily defended or politically significant target, seize leadership elements, and then broadcast their torture and execution across all available channels. Surrounding worlds, watching what happened to those who resisted, invariably chose submission over similar treatment. The strategy worked with brutal efficiency, each successful operation adding to the Legion's reputation and making the next compliance easier. Galtaner Prime fell without a single shot fired. The Hive world had maintained independence through a combination of strong defensive fleets and diplomatic maneuvering, playing various Imperial expeditionary fleets against each other while avoiding outright hostility. When the Night Lord's fleet entered the system, the planetary government immediately opened communications channels. They had heard what happened at Cherokee, at V-Hordak, at the Septimus Cluster. They knew what the Night Lords did to worlds that resisted. The compliance documents were transmitted before Curze's flagship reached stable orbit. The world's entire industrial output was pledged to the Crusade. The defensive fleets were integrated into the Imperial Navy. Galtaner Prime became a model Imperial world without the Night Lords ever deploying to its surface. This pattern repeated across hundreds of systems. The Night Lords' reputation preceded them like a bow wave, softening targets before the fleet even arrived. Rebellious populations deposed their own leaders rather than face the Night Haunter's judgment. Secessionist movements collapsed when their members learned the Night Lords had been assigned to bring their worlds back into compliance. Entire sectors maintained perfect obedience to Imperial dictates because they existed within the Night Lord's operational area and knew that any hint of resistance would bring the 8th Legion down upon them. From a strategic perspective, Curze had created the most cost-effective compliance mechanism in the entire Great Crusade. The War Council's response to these successes remained complicated and increasingly troubled. Malcador the Sigillite recognized the tactical value of the Night Lord's methods while finding them personally abhorrent. The Emperor's right hand understood that the Crusade required pragmatism and that Curze's approach saved Imperial lives and resources. Yet the reports coming from Night Lord's operations detailed atrocities that went far beyond military necessity. Entire populations flayed for the crime of their leaders' resistance. Children tortured in front of their parents to extract confessions of crimes that may or may not have occurred. Worlds left in states of psychological trauma so severe that their productivity and stability remained compromised for decades after compliance. Rogel Dorn brought his concerns directly to the Emperor on multiple occasions. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists saw in the Night Lords' methods a corruption of everything the Crusade supposedly represented. The Imperium claimed to bring enlightenment and unity to scattered human populations, to elevate humanity from the darkness of Old Night into a new Golden Age. How did systematically terrorizing populations into submission serve that goal? How did creating worlds that obeyed purely out of fear, rather than belief in the Imperial truth, advance the Emperor's vision? Dorn argued that the Night Lords were creating compliance without loyalty, obedience without understanding, submission without genuine integration into the Imperial culture. The Emperor's response to these concerns remained characteristically enigmatic. He did not order Curze to modify his methods or rein in the Night Lord's excesses. Neither did he offer full-throated endorsement of the terror tactics that were bringing so many worlds into compliance. The Master of Mankind seemed content to allow the Night Lords to continue their operations, while other legions pursued more conventional approaches, perhaps recognizing that different situations required different tools. Or perhaps he already saw in his prophetic sight what Curze would become, and judged that attempting to change the Night Haunter's nature would prove futile. Guilliman of the Ultramarines represented another voice of criticism, though his objections focused on practical rather than moral considerations. The Lord of Macragge argued that the Night Lord's methods created unstable compliance that required constant reinforcement through fear. Worlds brought into the Imperium through terror would rebel the moment they perceived weakness or believed they could escape punishment. In contrast, populations that understood the benefits of imperial rule and genuinely embraced the imperial truth would remain loyal even during times of crisis. Guilliman's own 500 Worlds of Ultramar demonstrated his alternative approach, worlds transformed through infrastructure development, education, and integration into efficient administrative systems that made imperial rule beneficial rather than merely bearable. The debate over methods played out in War Council chambers and during the rare gatherings when multiple Primarchs found themselves in the same location. Curze defended his approach with cold logic, pointing out that the Ultramarines' nation building required decades of investment and ongoing administration. The Night Lords brought compliance in weeks or months with minimal resource expenditure. The Imperium was expanding too rapidly to apply Guilliman's methods to every world. There were not enough Ultramarines, not enough administrators, not enough time to transform each conquered population into model imperial citizens. Terror offered a shortcut that achieved the immediate goal of bringing worlds under imperial authority, after which other institutions could handle the long-term work of integration. Privately, many within the War Council recognized an uncomfortable truth in Curze's arguments. The Great Crusade was expanding faster than the Imperium's ability to properly administer and integrate new territories. Worlds brought into compliance were often left with minimal imperial presence, their populations expected to maintain order and productivity with little oversight or support. The Night Lords' methods at least ensured that these populations remained obedient even without significant imperial military presence. Fear of the Night Lords' return kept recently compliant worlds from immediately rebelling once the fleets moved on to new targets. The other legions' responses to the Night Lords varied based on their own doctrines and their Primarchs' personalities. The World Eaters, already showing signs of the aggression that would later consume them entirely, considered the Night Lords cowards who terrorized civilians rather than facing worthy opponents in honest battle. Angron made his contempt clear during the few occasions when the two legions operated in proximity, his warriors eager to prove their superiority through direct combat rather than what they saw as the Night Lords' sneaking and torture. The Iron Hands viewed the 8th Legion's methods with cold pragmatism. If terror tactics achieved compliance efficiently, they served the Omnissiah's purpose, though Ferrus Manus personally found the emphasis on psychological warfare distasteful compared to the purity of technological superiority. The Space Wolves represented perhaps the most interesting case of conflicted opinion. Leman Russ and his warriors understood savage warfare and the value of fear as a weapon. They cultivated their own reputation as the Emperor's executioners, the legion that could be unleashed against threats that required complete annihilation rather than mere defeat. Yet even the Space Wolves found the Night Lords' methods excessive and dishonorable. The Wolves killed enemies in battle and executed those judged worthy of death, but they did not torture for psychological effect or terrorize civilian populations as a primary tactic. Russ viewed Curze with a mixture of wariness and contempt, recognizing a fellow predator, but one whose hunting methods violated the Space Wolves' own code of honor. The Night Lords themselves remained largely indifferent to their brother legion's opinions. They had been created to bring compliance through terror, and they fulfilled that purpose with devastating effectiveness. The Nostramo majority within the Legion's ranks cared nothing for the approval of warriors they viewed as hypocrites who committed their own atrocities while maintaining pretenses of honor and nobility. The Terran veterans who remembered the Legion before Curze's arrival found their voices increasingly marginalized as Nostramo recruits came to dominate the Legion's culture and command structure. Some of these Terrans transferred to other legions, when possible seeking escape from what their legion was becoming. Others remained, either believing in Curze's methods or simply accepting that they had no other place in the Imperium. While the Night Lords achieved victory after victory across the Crusade's expanding frontiers, Nostramo itself deteriorated in Curze's absence. The Primarch had imposed order on his homeworld through personal terror, his presence the only thing preventing the planet's criminal elements from reasserting control. With Curze gone and the most violent members of the population recruited into the Legion, a power vacuum emerged that the old aristocratic families and criminal organizations moved quickly to fill. The fear of the Night Haunter's return kept the most blatant criminality suppressed for a time, but as years turned into decades and Curze remained absent, that fear gradually faded. The criminal enterprises that had once ruled Nostramo's underhives began to reconstitute themselves, initially operating cautiously but growing bolder as they realized no punishment was forthcoming. The aristocratic families who had lost their power to exploit the lower classes under Curze's reign found new ways to extract wealth and labor from the population. Corruption spread through the enforcers and administrators who maintained order in the Primarch's absence, these officials discovering that they could profit from the same criminal activities they were supposed to prevent. Within 2 generations of Curze's departure, Nostramo had reverted to something resembling its pre-unification state, though the population had learned to maintain a facade of order that would satisfy distant imperial oversight. The deterioration of Nostramo created a crisis for the Night Lords that would have profound implications for the Legion's future. The recruitment stock coming from the homeworld changed as the planet's criminal elements regained control. Where Curze had initially recruited from those who understood violence, but had been shaped by his reign of terror into something resembling disciplined warriors, the Legion now drew from populations that had grown up in a renewed culture of criminality and exploitation. These new recruits brought with them the worst aspects of Nostraman society: casual cruelty, sadistic tendencies, complete lack of empathy, and a view of violence as entertainment rather than a tool. The Legion's apothecaries and training cadre noticed the change in recruit quality, but found themselves unable to address it effectively. The gene seed implantation and hypno-indoctrination processes that transformed baseline humans into Astartes could enhance physical capabilities and implant tactical knowledge, but they could not fundamentally alter personality traits or moral frameworks. The new Nostraman recruits emerged from training as fully capable space marines who happened to be psychologically damaged individuals given superhuman abilities and sanction to commit atrocities in the Imperium's name. They joined companies and chapters already dominated by earlier Nostraman recruits, reinforcing and amplifying the cultural problems that had been developing within the Legion since Curze first began drawing from his homeworld. Reports began reaching the War Council of Night Lords operations that went beyond even the excessive brutality that had become their standard practice. Entire populations flayed when smaller examples would have sufficed for compliance. Torture extended for days or weeks beyond any tactical purpose, becoming recreational activity for Legion members rather than psychological warfare. Civilian populations on compliant worlds terrorized by Night Lords' garrison forces that seemed incapable of distinguishing between enemies and the Imperial citizens they were supposed to protect. These reports painted a picture of a Legion that had crossed the line from brutal effectiveness into sadistic excess, warriors who committed atrocities not because terror tactics served strategic purposes, but because they enjoyed inflicting suffering. The whispers began in War Council chambers and spread through the upper echelons of Imperial command. The Night Lords had become the very thing they were meant to destroy. They were no longer warriors bringing order through fear, but criminals granted power, armor, and fleet assets, predators unleashed upon the Imperium's enemies, and increasingly upon Imperial populations themselves. The Legion that had been created to demonstrate the consequences of resisting Imperial authority had transformed into a threat that required its own consequences. Yet no one possessed the authority or the will to confront Konrad Curze directly about what his Legion had become, and the Night Haunter himself seemed either unaware of the deterioration or grimly satisfied that his warriors were proving his theories about human nature correct. The reports reached Konrad Curze in fragments over several years, each one adding another piece to a picture he had already seen in his visions decades earlier. Nostramo had reverted. The world he had unified through terror, the planet he had transformed from a criminal hellscape into a functioning society through sheer brutality, had collapsed back into the darkness from which he had dragged it. The aristocratic families once again controlled the adamantium mines and the industrial complexes, extracting wealth through exploitation and violence. The underhives had returned to gang rule, with criminal organizations operating openly in territories that law enforcement no longer dared to enter. The enforcers and administrators who should have maintained order instead participated in the corruption, taking bribes and protection money from the same criminals they were supposed to suppress. Worse still, the Legion's own recruitment apparatus had become complicit in Nostramo's decay. The officers and apothecaries stationed on the homeworld to identify and process suitable candidates had established themselves as a new tier of aristocracy, using their authority to enrich themselves and their families. They accepted bribes from wealthy families seeking to place their sons in the Legion, prioritizing connections over actual suitability for transformation into Astartes. They formed alliances with criminal organizations, providing protection in exchange for access to resources and luxuries. Some had even established their own criminal enterprises, using their status as representatives of the 8th Legion to operate with impunity. The recruitment system that should have been drawing the finest candidates from Nostramo's population had instead become another mechanism of corruption, funneling the sons of criminals and aristocrats into the Legion regardless of their psychological fitness for the transformation. The intelligence reports detailed specific examples that painted a comprehensive picture of institutional collapse. Recruitment officer Var Shek, a veteran of the Terran intake who had served with distinction during the early Crusade, had established a protection racket across 3 hive cities. He employed gangers as enforcers, using the threat of Night Lord's retaliation against anyone who challenged his authority. Captain Sahel of the Atrementor, Curze's own elite Terminators, maintained a palace in Nostramo Quintus that rivaled the governor's residence in opulence, funded through kickbacks from industrial families seeking favorable recruitment consideration for their heirs. Apothecary Talos had been discovered running an organ harvesting operation, selling gene seed components and biological materials to the highest bidders rather than properly processing them according to Legion protocols. These revelations confirmed what Curze had always known would happen, what his visions had shown him with perfect clarity. His methods had failed. Terror could suppress human nature temporarily, but it could not transform it. The moment the threat of immediate punishment diminished, the old patterns reasserted themselves. Nostramo under his rule had been no different than Nostramo before his arrival, the same corruption and criminality, merely driven underground and waiting for the opportunity to resurface. The population had not learned justice or morality from his reign of terror. They had only learned to hide their crimes more carefully and to resume them the moment they believed they could escape consequences. The Night Haunter saw in Nostramos collapse the validation of his darkest beliefs about humanity and the futility of the Imperium's entire project. If even his homeworld, subjected to decades of the most brutal enforcement imaginable, could not maintain order without his constant presence, what hope did the Emperor's vision have of creating a lasting civilization? The Imperium was building an empire on foundations of sand, pretending that conquest and compliance could transform human nature, when all they actually accomplished was temporary suppression of humanity's inherent corruption. Every world brought into imperial authority would eventually revert to barbarism and criminality once the fleets moved on, and the immediate threat of punishment faded. The Great Crusade was not saving humanity, but merely postponing its inevitable self-destruction. Curze made his decision without consulting the War Council or seeking approval from his father. The Night Lord's fleet altered course from its current campaign and set coordinates for Nostramo. The journey took several months, during which Curze maintained absolute silence about his intentions. His captains and company commanders recognized their Primarch's dark mood, but knew better than to question him directly. The Terran veterans who remained in positions of authority suspected what was coming, having served long enough to understand how their Primarch's mind worked. The Nostraman majority assumed they were returning home for recruitment or resupply, perhaps to address the corruption that had infected the Legion's operations on their homeworld. The fleet emerged from the warp at Nostramo's system edge, and proceeded directly toward the homeworld without any communication with planetary authorities. The orbital defense platforms, staffed by crews who recognized the Night Lord's fleet signature, did not challenge their approach. The planetary governor transmitted standard greetings and prepared to receive the Primarch with appropriate ceremony. The recruitment facilities activated their processing centers, expecting a major intake of new candidates. Nostramo's population, those aware enough to track fleet movements, felt a mixture of pride and anxiety at their legion's return. They did not yet understand that the Night Lords had not come home for recruitment or resupply. Curze ordered the fleet into bombardment formation once they achieved stable orbit. The command surprised his officers, many of whom initially assumed they had misunderstood or that the order was intended for some other target in the system. When the Primarch confirmed the targeting parameters and made clear that Nostramo itself was the target, confusion turned to shock among the Terran veterans and something approaching horror among the Nostraman members of the Legion. Captains requested clarification, seeking some explanation that would make sense of an order to destroy their own homeworld. Curze provided one, his words transmitted across the entire fleet so that every member of the Legion would understand what was about to happen and why. The world below them had proven that his methods were failures, Curze explained with cold precision. Nostramo had been given the opportunity to maintain the order he had established, to demonstrate that terror could create lasting change in human behavior. Instead, the planet had reverted to its original state of corruption and criminality the moment his personal enforcement was removed. The population had learned nothing from his reign except how to hide their crimes more effectively. The aristocratic families had resumed their exploitation. The criminals had rebuilt their organizations. The enforcers had become as corrupt as those they were supposed to police. Even the Legion's own recruitment apparatus had been infected by Nostramo's inherent moral decay. Therefore, Nostramo had no further value to the Legion or the Imperium. It was a cancer that would continue producing corrupted recruits, spreading its rot throughout the 8th Legion until the entire force became indistinguishable from the criminals they had been created to punish. The only logical response was excision. The world that had birthed the Night Haunter would die by his hand, a final demonstration that nothing, not even a Primarch's homeworld, was exempt from judgment when it failed to meet the standards required for continued existence. The bombardment began with the major hive cities. Cyclonic torpedoes and lance strikes targeted the most densely populated areas first. The weapons designed to crack planetary crusts and boil atmospheres turned against population centers that had no defenses capable of stopping them. Nostramo Quintus, the city where Curze had first emerged from the Underhive to begin his campaign of terror, died in the opening salvo. The hive collapsed in on itself as the bedrock beneath it liquefied under the bombardment's intensity. Millions of inhabitants crushed or incinerated in seconds. The other major hives followed in sequence, each one targeted with sufficient firepower to ensure complete destruction. The orbital strikes created firestorms that consumed everything within hundreds of kilometers of impact sites, the flames visible from orbit as spreading patches of orange and red across Nostramo's dark surface. The planetary governor managed to transmit a single desperate plea for explanation before his palace was vaporized by a direct lance strike. Recruitment facilities that had been preparing to receive the Legion were obliterated along with their surrounding territories. Industrial complexes that produced equipment and supplies for the Night Lords burned alongside the worker habitations that surrounded them. The adamantium mines that had been Nostramo's primary economic asset collapsed as the bombardment destabilized the geological formations that contained them. The planet's infrastructure, built up over millennia of human habitation, disintegrated under an assault that showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. Some among the fleet's crew attempted to intervene. A few Nostraman captains refused the bombardment orders, their ships breaking formation in futile protest against the destruction of their homeworld. Curze had anticipated this response and positioned loyal elements of the fleet to intercept any vessels that attempted to leave their assigned positions. The ships that refused orders were destroyed by their own battle brothers, adding their wreckage to the debris field that was beginning to form around Nostramo as the bombardment continued. The executions of the disobedient captains served as a clear message to the rest of the fleet. The destruction of Nostramo was not subject to debate or modification. Any who could not accept this reality had no place in the Night Lord's Legion. The bombardment continued for hours, the fleet's weapons systematically working through target lists that covered every significant population center and industrial facility on the planet's surface. When the major targets had been eliminated, the bombardment shifted to area denial, carpet-bombing territories that might have survived the initial strikes. The goal was not merely to kill Nostramo's population, but to render the world itself uninhabitable, to ensure that nothing could ever be rebuilt from the ruins. The planet's atmosphere began to burn as the bombardment's intensity created firestorms that consumed available oxygen and generated toxic clouds of vaporized material. The eternal darkness that had defined Nostramo for as long as records existed was replaced by the hellish glow of a world dying under orbital fire. Curze watched the destruction from his flagship's observation deck, his gaunt face illuminated by the reflected light of his homeworld's death. He felt no satisfaction in what he was doing, no sense of vengeance or righteous anger. The destruction of Nostramo was simply logical necessity, the inevitable conclusion of an experiment that had proven his theories about human nature and the futility of attempting to impose order through fear alone. The world below had failed its test, demonstrating that his methods could not create lasting change. Therefore, it had no further purpose and deserved no mercy. The Night Haunter had come full circle, returning to the world of his birth to deliver the same judgment he had once inflicted on its criminals and corrupt aristocrats, only now applied to the entire planet rather than individual sinners. The psychological impact on the Legion was immediate and profound. The Nostraman majority, watching their homeworld die under their own fleet's guns, experienced a collective trauma that shattered whatever remained of their connection to anything beyond the Legion itself. They had been criminals and gang members, aristocrats and underhive survivors, but they had all been Nostraman. That identity, that connection to a specific place and culture, had provided some foundation for their existence even as they committed atrocities across the galaxy in the Legion's name. Now that foundation was gone, vaporized along with the cities and territories where they had been born. They were Night Lords and nothing else, warriors without homeworld or heritage, defined entirely by their capacity for violence and terror. The Terran veterans who had watched their Legion transform under Nostraman influence felt vindicated and horrified in equal measure. They had warned that drawing so heavily from a single corrupted world would eventually poison the Legion's character. Curze's decision to destroy Nostramo proved they had been correct, but it also demonstrated how completely their Primarch had abandoned any pretense of serving the Imperium's stated goals. The Emperor's legions were meant to bring worlds into compliance and integrate them into Imperial authority, not annihilate them when they proved imperfect. The destruction of Nostramo was an admission that the Night Lord's entire approach to conquest and compliance had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The fatalism that had always characterized the Night Lord's outlook intensified into something approaching nihilism. If their own homeworld could be destroyed for failing to maintain the order their Primarch had imposed, what value did any world have? What purpose did compliance serve if planets would eventually be judged unworthy and eliminated? The visions that plagued Curze and some of his sons showed a future where the Imperium tore itself apart, where the Emperor's dream collapsed into eternal warfare and humanity devoured itself in an orgy of violence. Nostramo's destruction seemed to prove that this future was not just inevitable, but already beginning, with the Night Lords themselves serving as instruments of the Imperium's eventual self-destruction. Word of Nostramo's destruction reached the War Council through astropathic transmission within weeks of the bombardment. The initial reports were fragmentary and difficult to believe. A Primarch had destroyed his own homeworld, eliminating millions of Imperial citizens and obliterating critical industrial infrastructure without authorization or apparent cause. Malkador, the Sigillite, immediately recognized the implications. This was not a military operation that had escalated beyond acceptable parameters or a compliance action that had employed excessive force. This was a deliberate act of annihilation directed against an imperial world by one of the Emperor's own sons, an action that could not be justified under any interpretation of the Primarch's authority or the Legion's mandate. The Emperor's response, when it came, was measured but unmistakably a censure. Curze was summoned to Terra to explain his actions before the War Council. The Night Lord's Legion was placed under observation, with other Legion elements positioned to monitor their activities and intervene if they showed signs of further unauthorized actions against Imperial territories. The official position maintained that Nostramo had been destroyed due to corruption that threatened to compromise the 8th Legion's integrity, framing the action as extreme but ultimately justified by necessity. This explanation satisfied no one who understood the actual situation, but it provided a framework that allowed the Imperium to avoid the immediate crisis of publicly acknowledging that one of the Primarchs had gone rogue. Curze ignored the summons to Terra. His fleet departed the Nostramo system and resumed campaign operations without any acknowledgement of the War Council's communications. He had seen in his visions that his father would eventually send assassins to kill him, that the Emperor had already judged him unworthy, and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to execute that judgment. The summons to Terra was likely a trap, an opportunity to eliminate him in a controlled environment where his death could be managed without triggering a wider crisis. The Night Haunter would not cooperate in his own execution, would not make it easy for the Emperor to dispose of a son who had proven inconvenient. He would continue his campaigns, bringing compliance through terror as he had always done, until the future his visions had shown him finally arrived. The rift between Curze and the Imperium, which had been growing since the early years of the Crusade, became unbridgeable after Nostramo's destruction. Other Primarchs who had previously defended the Night Lord's methods or argued for their tactical value now distanced themselves from the 8th Legion. Rogel Dorn cited Nostramo as proof that terror tactics corrupted those who employed them, that the Night Lords had become the very criminals they were meant to punish. Guilliman pointed out that destroying an entire Imperial world represented a catastrophic failure of governance and judgment, qualities that should disqualify Curze from continued independent command. Even Primarchs like Perdurabo, who had no particular affection for the Imperium's idealistic rhetoric, recognized that annihilating one's own recruiting world suggested severe psychological instability that made Curze a potential threat to any operation he participated in. The Night Lords found themselves increasingly isolated from the rest of the Crusade's forces. Joint operations with other legions became rare as commanders requested reassignment rather than work alongside the 8th Legion. Imperial army units refused deployment to campaigns where Night Lords elements were present, their commanders citing concerns about the safety of their troops from their supposed allies. Supply convoys delayed or rerouted shipments to Night Lords' fleets, forcing the Legion to rely more heavily on captured materiel and resources extracted from the worlds they brought into compliance. The Legion that had once been one of the Crusade's most effective instruments of expansion became a force that operated on the fringes, taking assignments that other legions refused and conducting campaigns with minimal support from the wider Imperial military apparatus. The rebellion came as no surprise to Konrad Curze. His visions had shown him the War Master's fall years before Horus set foot on Davin's moon, before the warrior lodges had spread their poison through the legions, before the first shots of the Civil War were fired. The Night Haunter had watched the heresy unfold in his prophetic nightmares countless times, seeing the exact sequence of betrayals and battles that would tear the Imperium apart. When word reached him that Horus had declared against the Emperor and that a third of the legions had sided with the War Master, Curze felt only grim satisfaction that reality was finally catching up to the visions that had tormented him for decades. The Imperium's hypocrisy would be laid bare, the Emperor's dream would burn, and Curze himself would play his appointed role in the catastrophe. The decision to join Horus required no deliberation. Curze had been censured for destroying Nostramo, condemned by the very Imperium that had unleashed him upon non-compliant worlds, with instructions to terrorize them into submission. The Emperor and his War Council had been perfectly content to employ the Night Lord's methods when those methods brought worlds into compliance quickly and efficiently. They had accepted the flayed populations and the terror campaigns as necessary evils in service of the Great Crusade's expansion. But when Curze turned those same methods against a world that had failed to maintain the order he had imposed, suddenly his actions became unacceptable. The hypocrisy was obvious and damning. The Imperium wanted the benefits of terror tactics without acknowledging the moral cost of employing them, wanted to use the Night Lords as instruments of brutality, while maintaining the fiction that the Crusade represented enlightenment and progress. Curze's visions had already shown him his ultimate fate. The Emperor would send assassins to kill him, judging his son unworthy and dangerous enough to require elimination. This future was fixed and unchangeable, another piece of the predetermined path that Curze had been walking since his birth. If he was already condemned, already marked for death by his own father, then the choice between loyalty and rebellion became meaningless. He could remain loyal to an emperor who had already decided to kill him, or he could embrace the damnation that his visions promised was inevitable. Either way, the outcome would be the same. The Night Haunter would die alone in the darkness, murdered for being exactly what the Emperor had created him to be. The Night Lords joined the War Master's forces without ceremony or grand declarations. Curze simply transmitted his allegiance to Horus and began redirecting his fleet toward targets designated by the traitor command structure. There was no worship of the chaos gods involved in this decision, no corruption by the ruinous powers that had claimed so many other traitor legions. The Night Lords sided with Horus because their Primarch had seen the Imperium's true nature and found it worthy only of destruction, because Curze's censure had proven that the Emperor's vision was built on lies and hypocrisy, because the visions showed that this was the path they were always meant to walk. The War Master's rebellion provided an opportunity to tear down the false edifice of imperial righteousness and reveal the brutal reality that Curze had always known lay beneath the surface. The opening moves of the heresy saw the Night Lords deployed against loyalist forces across multiple theaters. Their expertise in terror tactics and rapid strikes made them valuable assets for operations that required speed and psychological impact rather than prolonged engagement. At Istvan III, the Night Lords participated in the virus bombing that killed loyalists within the traitor legions, their ships part of the fleet that unleashed the Life Eater virus upon the surface. The weapon reduced the population and the loyalist Astartes to liquefied biomass within minutes, an act of mass murder that dwarfed even the Night Lords' most extreme compliance actions during the Crusade. Curze watched the planet die beneath clouds of viral agents and felt nothing. This was what the Imperium had always been beneath its rhetoric of enlightenment, a machine that killed anyone who stood in the way of its expansion, whether they were aliens, non-compliant humans, or its own warriors. The Night Lords ranged across the Imperium's eastern fringe during the early years of the heresy, striking at loyalist supply lines, communication networks, and isolated garrisons. They excelled at the kind of asymmetric warfare that the rebellion required in its initial phases, when traitor forces were still consolidating their strength and could not afford prolonged engagements with loyalist legion elements. Night Lord strike forces would emerge from the warp, hit targets with overwhelming speed and brutality, then disappear before loyalist reinforcements could arrive. They destroyed supply depots that fed loyalist war efforts, assassinated commanders whose leadership held defensive networks together, and terrorized populations on worlds that remained loyal to Terra. The psychological impact of these raids often exceeded their tactical value. Loyalist forces found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering when the Night Lords would strike next and whether their defenses would prove sufficient when the attack came. The Legion's reputation for atrocity grew even darker during the heresy. Freed from any pretense of serving the Emperor's vision, the Night Lords indulged their worst impulses without restraint. Captured loyalists were not simply executed, but tortured for days or weeks, their suffering broadcast across Vox channels to demoralize other Imperial forces in the region. Civilian populations on loyalist worlds experienced the full horror of Night Lords' occupation, entire cities flayed as examples to neighboring territories. The Nostraman majority within the Legion, already psychologically damaged by their homeworld's destruction, embraced the heresy as an opportunity to inflict suffering without limit or consequence. They were no longer pretending to serve the Imperium's goals or maintain any standards of conduct beyond what their Primarch demanded. They were simply killers given license to kill, predators unleashed upon a galaxy tearing itself apart. The Thrama's crusade represented the Night Lord's most significant military campaign during the Heresy and Curze's most personal conflict with another Primarch. The Dark Angels had been racing back to Terra when they received intelligence about traitor fleet movements in the Thrama's sector. Lionel Johnson, the First Legion's Primarch, made the decision to intercept and destroy these forces rather than continue directly to his father's side. The Night Lord's fleet that the Lion sought to eliminate was Curze's own, and the Night Haunter had no intention of avoiding the confrontation. His visions had shown him this campaign, had revealed the 3 years of brutal warfare that would devastate both legions while the wider heresy raged across the galaxy. Curze welcomed the opportunity to face his brother, to prove that the Dark Angel's pretensions of honor and nobility were as hollow as the Imperium's claims of righteousness. The campaign began with a series of ambushes that demonstrated the Night Lord's superiority in void warfare and intelligence gathering. Curze had spent months seeding the Thrama's sector with agents and informants, building a network that provided detailed intelligence about Dark Angel's fleet movements and defensive positions. When the Lion's forces entered the sector, they found themselves walking into traps at every turn. Night Lord's strike cruisers would emerge from the void to cripple Dark Angel's vessels, then disappear before the Loyalist fleet could respond in force. Supply convoys were intercepted and destroyed, their crews flayed and left in life pods that broadcast their dying screams across all frequencies. Forward operating bases established by the Dark Angels were infiltrated and their garrisons slaughtered, the bodies arranged in elaborate displays designed to maximize psychological impact on the forces that discovered them. The Lion adapted to Night Lord's tactics with the strategic brilliance that had made him one of the Imperium's greatest military commanders. He divided his forces into smaller, more mobile elements that could respond quickly to Night Lord's attacks. He established redundant supply lines that made interdiction less effective. He used his own intelligence networks to identify Night Lord's staging areas and hit them with overwhelming force before they could disperse. The campaign evolved into a brutal game of move and countermove, each Primarch trying to anticipate and counter the other's strategies while managing the grinding attrition that was destroying both legions. Fleet engagements became more frequent and more savage as both sides committed larger forces to decisive battles that never quite proved decisive. Planetary assaults turned into prolonged sieges as Night Lord's forces found themselves unable to break Dark Angel's defensive positions through terror tactics alone. Curze and the Lion met in personal combat multiple times during the campaign, their confrontations growing increasingly vicious as the months turned into years. The first encounter occurred aboard a crippled space station in the Sheol system, where both Primarchs had led boarding actions that converged on the station's central command deck. They fought through corridors filled with the dead and dying of both legions, trading blows that cratered bulkheads and shattered support structures. Curze's lightning claws carved deep wounds across the Lion's armor, while the Dark Angel's Primarch's sword opened gashes in Curze's torso that would have killed a normal Astartes instantly. Neither could gain a decisive advantage before structural failure forced both to evacuate the station before it broke apart completely. Their second major confrontation took place on the surface of Tsagualsa, a world in the Thrama's sector that the Night Lords had claimed as a temporary base of operations. The Lion led a drop assault directly on Curze's position, his Terminators smashing through Night Lord's defensive positions with the kind of frontal assault that the 8th Legion was poorly equipped to counter. The battle devolved into a close-quarters melee in the ruins of the fortress where Curze had established his command center. The two Primarchs fought amid the wreckage and the bodies of their sons, each trying to kill the other, while their legions tore each other apart around them. Curze used every dirty trick he knew, exploiting the terrain and the darkness to launch ambushes from unexpected angles. The Lion met each attack with precise counterstrikes, his combat style refined through centuries of warfare into something approaching perfection. The fight ended without resolution, when Night Lord's reinforcements arrived in sufficient numbers to force the Dark Angels to withdraw or risk being overwhelmed. The psychological warfare between the two Primarchs matched the physical violence of their confrontations. Curze took perverse pleasure in tormenting the Lion with revelations about the Dark Angel's secrets, information gleaned from his visions and from captured prisoners. He knew about the Fallen, the Dark Angels who had turned traitor on Caliban, and he used that knowledge to needle his brother during their battles. The Lion's response was cold fury, barely held in check, his hatred for Curze transcending ideology to become something deeply personal. Where other Primarchs fought for the Emperor or for Horus, the Lion fought Curze because he recognized in the Night Haunter a corruption that needed to be eliminated regardless of which side ultimately won the heresy. The campaign's climax came in the final year, when both legions had been reduced to shadows of their former strength. The Dark Angels had lost nearly half their number, fleet assets destroyed or too damaged to remain combat effective. The Night Lords had suffered similar casualties, their advantage in mobility and intelligence gathering eroded by the Lion's adaptive strategies and the simple attrition of 3 years of constant warfare. The final confrontation between Curze and the Lion occurred during a battle aboard the Night Lord's flagship, where the Dark Angel's Primarch led a desperate boarding action designed to decapitate the traitor command structure. The Lion found Curze in the ship's stratageum, surrounded by the bodies of Night Lords who had tried to stop the Dark Angel's assault. The two Primarchs fought without words or ceremony, their previous encounters having stripped away any pretense of honor or restraint. The Lion's sword carved through Curze's defenses with methodical precision, each strike designed to cripple rather than simply wound. Curze's lightning claws raked across his brother's armor, seeking the weak points in the ceramite that would allow him to reach the flesh beneath. The fight lasted for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, both Primarchs pushing their superhuman bodies to the absolute limit of endurance and capability. The Lion won through a combination of superior skill and sheer determination. He caught one of Curze's claws on his sword and used the momentary entanglement to drive his fist into the Night Haunter's face with enough force to shatter bone. Curze staggered backward, his vision blurring from the impact, and the Lion pressed his advantage. A series of brutal strikes drove Curze to his knees, blood streaming from wounds across his torso and face. The Dark Angel's Primarch raised his sword for a killing blow, but Night Lord's reinforcements arrived before he could deliver it. The Lion was forced to withdraw, dragging his wounded warriors back to their boarding craft, while the Night Lords regrouped around their fallen Primarch. Curze survived the encounter, but bore the scars for the rest of his life. The beating he had received from the Lion left him with injuries that even Primarch physiology could not fully heal, permanent damage that served as a constant reminder of his defeat. The Thrama's crusade ended shortly afterward, both legions too depleted to continue the campaign effectively. The Dark Angels withdrew toward Terra, having delayed but not destroyed the Night Lord's fleet. Curze led his battered legion deeper into the eastern fringe, seeking to rebuild his forces and continue prosecuting the war against the Imperium that had condemned him. Throughout the heresy, the Night Lords maintained their resistance to chaos worship despite fighting alongside legions that had embraced the ruinous powers completely. The word-bearers preached the divinity of the chaos gods and sought to spread their worship across the galaxy. The World Eaters had given themselves over to Khorne, their Primarch transformed into a demon prince. The Thousand Suns had fallen to Tzeentch, their sorcery fueled by the Changer of Ways. The Emperor's children served Slaanesh, pursuing sensation and excess to extremes that horrified even other traitors. The Night Lords looked upon all of this with contempt and disdain. They had not rebelled to replace one tyrant with 4 worse ones. They fought against the Imperium because it was hypocritical and corrupt, not because they sought the favor of entities that were demonstrably more corrupt and far more dangerous. Curze forbade chaos worship within his legion and executed any who showed signs of mutation or demonic corruption. The Night Lords would use the warp as a tool, would exploit the power that chaos offered when tactically advantageous, but they would not bow before the ruinous powers or accept their gifts. This resistance to corruption set them apart from most other traitor legions, and created tension with allies who saw the Night Lord's refusal to embrace chaos as weakness or foolish pride. The Word Bearers in particular found the Night Lord's secular cruelty baffling and offensive, unable to understand why anyone would reject the truth of the gods when that truth had been so clearly revealed. Curze's response was characteristically blunt. He had not spent his entire life fighting against tyranny and lies only to submit to new masters who were objectively worse than the Emperor had ever been. The world of Tsagualsa existed as little more than a cartographic footnote before the Night Lords claimed it, located in the eastern fringes far beyond the Imperium's established territories. The planet had died long before humanity reached the stars. Whatever civilization had once existed there had collapsed so completely that even their ruins had eroded into geological features indistinguishable from natural formations. The atmosphere remained breathable but thin, the surface a wasteland of gray rock and dust, broken only by the skeletal remains of ancient structures whose original purpose could no longer be determined. No flora grew in the contaminated soil. No fauna moved across the barren plains. Tsagualsa was a tomb world in the most literal sense, a planet where death had achieved such totality that even the memory of life had been scoured away by millennia of abandonment. Curze chose this dead world deliberately after the Thrama's crusade had left his legion battered and depleted. The Night Lords needed a base of operations beyond the reach of loyalist forces, somewhere they could rebuild their strength and consolidate the remnants of companies scattered across the eastern fringe during the chaotic final stages of the campaign against the Dark Angels. Tsagualsa's location provided strategic advantages that outweighed its inhospitable nature. The world sat at the intersection of several stable warp routes, allowing fleet elements to disperse quickly if threatened, while maintaining the ability to reconvene when necessary. Its distance from major Imperial holdings meant that loyalist forces would require significant time and resources to mount an assault, time that would provide ample warning through the intelligence networks the Night Lords maintained throughout the region. The establishment of the fortress complex began within weeks of the Legion's arrival. Night Lords who had once been architects and engineers on Nostramo directed the construction, their plans incorporating the ruins of the ancient civilization into a sprawling network of bunkers, landing platforms, and defensive emplacements. The work proceeded with surprising efficiency despite the Legion's depleted state. Companies that had been scattered during the retreat from Thramas converged on Tsagualsa, bringing with them the resources and equipment they had salvaged from destroyed vessels and abandoned outposts. The fortress grew organically rather than according to any unified design, each captain and company commander establishing their own territory within the larger complex according to their needs and the strength of their remaining forces. The central palace that Curze claimed for himself rose from the largest of the ancient ruins, a structure that had once been a pyramid or ziggurat before millennia of erosion had reduced it to a stepped hill of crumbling stone. The Night Lords hollowed out the interior and reinforced it with ferrocrete and plasteel, creating a labyrinthine complex that reflected their Primarch's deteriorating mental state. Corridors branched and reconnected without apparent logic, some leading to chambers of obvious purpose, while others terminated in dead ends or circular paths that returned to their starting points. The lighting throughout the palace remained deliberately dim, the shadows deep enough that even Astartes' vision struggled to penetrate them completely. Curze spent weeks personally overseeing the palace's construction, his instructions growing increasingly erratic as the project progressed, but always maintaining a terrible internal consistency that suggested method within the madness. The decoration of Tsagualsa began as a practical matter and evolved into something approaching religious devotion among certain elements of the Legion. The Night Lords had always taken trophies from their victims, but the static nature of their new base allowed for displays that would have been impractical aboard fleet vessels. The first editions were simple enough: skulls mounted on spikes along the approaches to the fortress, flayed skins stretched across frames to mark territorial boundaries between different companies. These modest beginnings escalated as the months passed and more Night Lords arrived at Tsagualsa, each bringing their own collections of preserved remains and adding them to the growing display. The palace approaches became an exhibition of horror that stretched for kilometers across Tsaguelsa's gray plains. Thousands of bodies hung from chains and hooks, their preservation maintained through a combination of the planet's dry atmosphere and chemical treatments applied by Legion apothecaries who had found a new purpose in curating this gallery of death. The corpses represented victims from across the Night Lord's history, Imperial army soldiers who had died during compliance actions decades earlier, Dark Angels captured during the Thrama's crusade, civilian populations from worlds that had resisted too strongly or simply been in the wrong place when the Legion needed to make an example. Each body had been arranged in specific poses, positioned to create tableaus that told stories of suffering and terror to anyone capable of reading the visual language the Night Lords had developed. The interior of Curze's palace exceeded even the external displays in its commitment to transforming human remains into architectural elements. The walls of major corridors were lined with alcoves, each containing a preserved corpse positioned as though standing guard. These were not random victims, but individuals whose deaths had held particular significance, planetary governors who had refused compliance, military commanders who had fought with exceptional determination, traitors within the Legion itself who had been executed for various offenses. Curze could identify each one by sight, recounting the circumstances of their death and the lessons their fate was meant to teach. The Primarch spent hours walking these halls, conversing with the dead in a language that only he understood, seeking counsel from corpses that could provide no answers except those he imagined for them. The throne room that Curze established at the palace's heart represented the culmination of Tsaguelsa's transformation into a monument of death. The chamber had been carved from solid rock, its dimensions vast enough to accommodate hundreds of Astartes in full armor. The walls rose 30 meters to a vaulted ceiling where chains hung in intricate patterns, each supporting multiple bodies arranged in configurations that created larger images when viewed from the proper angles. The floor consisted of polished bone, thousands of human skulls fused together and ground smooth to create a surface that reflected the dim lighting with a sickly yellow glow. The throne itself had been constructed from the fused skeletons of exactly 100 victims, their bones shaped and positioned to create a seat that resembled a massive clawed hand rising from the floor to cradle whoever sat within it. Curze held court in this chamber, summoning his captains to receive orders or render reports on their activities. The Primarch's appearance during these audiences shocked even veterans who had served with him for decades. The beating he had received from the Lion during the Thrama's crusade had left visible damage that his healing factor could not fully repair. His face bore scars that twisted his features into a permanent expression of rage and pain. He moved with a slight limp, the result of improperly healed fractures in his left leg. His armor, once maintained to the exacting standards expected of a Primarch, showed signs of neglect and damage that had been repaired hastily, if at all. He looked like what he had become, a broken creature sustained only by hatred and the certainty that his visions of the future would eventually prove correct. The Legion's unity, always fragile and maintained primarily through fear of their Primarch's wrath, began to fragment seriously during the Tsaguelsa period. The Thrama's crusade had killed or scattered many of the veteran officers who had maintained some semblance of discipline and cohesion within the companies. The replacements who rose to fill these positions were younger, more brutal, and less inclined to accept Curze's authority without question. These new captains had grown up entirely within the Legion's culture of terror and sadism, lacking even the limited perspective that the Terran veterans or early Nostramo recruits had possessed. They saw Curze as a useful figurehead whose reputation provided legitimacy to their own ambitions, but they felt no genuine loyalty to him as a leader or father figure. The formation of distinct warbands accelerated as individual captains began pursuing their own agendas rather than coordinating their actions through the Legion's command structure. Captain Krieg Acerbus of the 10th Company established himself as an independent power, his forces conducting raids throughout the eastern fringe without reference to any larger strategic plan. First Captain Sevatar, who who had been one of the few officers capable of maintaining discipline through a combination of personal prowess and genuine respect from the Legion's rank and file, disappeared during the later stages of the Thrama's crusade under circumstances that remained unclear. His absence removed one of the last restraining influences on the Legion's fragmentation. Other captains followed Acerbus's example, taking their companies on extended campaigns that served their personal interests rather than any collective goal. The Atrementor, Curze's elite First Company Terminators, maintained their loyalty to the Primarch, but found their authority increasingly challenged by captains who commanded larger forces or controlled more resources. The Terminators served as enforcers when Curze needed to remind a particularly ambitious captain of who held ultimate authority within the Legion, but these interventions became less frequent as the Primarch withdrew deeper into his own madness. Curze seemed content to allow the Legion to fracture as long as individual warbands continued to prosecute the war against the Imperium in their own fashion. His visions had shown him that the Night Lords would never achieve unity or purpose beyond their capacity for inflicting terror, so the fragmentation simply confirmed what he had always known about the Legion's nature and ultimate fate. Internal power struggles became endemic as captains competed for resources, territory within the Tsagualsa fortress complex, and the limited opportunities for glory that remained available to a depleted traitor legion operating on the Imperium's fringes. These conflicts occasionally erupted into open violence, with rival companies exchanging fire within the fortress itself or ambushing each other during void operations. Curze intervened in these disputes only when they threatened to escalate into full-scale civil war within the Legion, his judgments swift and brutal but increasingly arbitrary. A captain might be executed for challenging a rival's authority one week, while a similar offense would be ignored or even tacitly encouraged the next. The inconsistency reflected the Primarch's deteriorating mental state and made the political situation within the Legion even more volatile, as officers struggled to determine which actions would provoke their Primarch's wrath and which would be overlooked. The complete abandonment of any pretense of noble purpose marked the final stage of the Night Lord's descent into pure terrorism, without even the fig leaf of tactical justification. During the Great Crusade, the Legion had at least maintained the fiction that their methods served the goal of bringing compliance and expanding the Imperium. Individual Night Lords might have committed atrocities for personal gratification, but the official position held that terror tactics were tools employed in service of strategic objectives. That pretense evaporated entirely at Tsagualsa. The warbands that launched from the Dead World attacked targets based on opportunity and the potential for inflicting suffering rather than any coherent military strategy. They raided Imperial worlds not to weaken the Loyalist war effort, but because the populations were vulnerable and their terror would be exquisite. They tortured captured enemies not to extract intelligence, but because the screams satisfied something broken within them. The Nostraman cultural elements that had always influenced the Legion's character became dominant to the point of caricature. The gang mentality that many recruits had brought from their homeworlds, Underhives now defined how companies and warbands related to each other. Territory within the Tsagualsa fortress was claimed and defended with the same vicious possessiveness that had characterized gang boundaries in Nostramo's hive cities. Officers surrounded themselves with cliques of loyal warriors who provided protection and muscle in exchange for a share of plunder and opportunities for violence. The elaborate system of insults, challenges, and face-saving gestures that had regulated conflicts between Nostraman gangs was replicated within the Legion, creating a complex social structure that outsiders found incomprehensible, but which made perfect sense to those who had grown up in that environment. The few remaining Terran veterans watched this transformation with disgust, but found themselves powerless to arrest or reverse it. They were outnumbered by factors of 10 or 20 to 1, their voices drowned out by the Nostraman majority that had come to define the Legion's identity. Some of these Terrans withdrew from active participation in Legion affairs, establishing their own small enclaves within the fortress, where they maintained the standards and traditions that had existed before Curze's discovery. Others attempted to work within the new reality, attaching themselves to captains who showed at least some capacity for strategic thinking and discipline. A few simply left, taking whatever vessels they could commander and disappearing into the void to pursue their own wars or seek service with other traitor legions that had not descended quite so far into dysfunction. Curze's personal deterioration accelerated during the Tsagualsa years, his already fragile mental state collapsing under the weight of isolation and the knowledge that his visions were coming true exactly as he had foreseen. He spent days at a time in his throne room, surrounded by his court of corpses, conducting conversations with the dead that grew increasingly elaborate and disturbing. He would address specific bodies as though they were still alive, asking their opinions on tactical matters or philosophical questions, then provide their responses in voices that mimicked how they had sounded before death. His captains, summoned to receive orders, would find their Primarch engaged in these dialogues and be forced to wait hours or even days until he acknowledged their presence. The visions that had always plagued Curze intensified in frequency and clarity during this period. He saw his own death with perfect detail now, no longer a distant inevitability, but an approaching certainty. The assassin who would kill him was already being prepared, the weapons that would end his life already being crafted, the orders that would send her to Tsagualsa already being contemplated by those who would issue them. He knew the exact circumstances of his death, alone in the darkness, unarmed and unarmored, accepting the blade that would end his existence as the final proof that everything he had believed about fate and inevitability was correct. The knowledge should have driven him to take precautions, to increase security or flee to a more defensible location. Instead, it paralyzed him with fatalistic certainty. There was no point in running from a future he had already witnessed, no value in fighting against a destiny that had been fixed since his birth. The palace on Tsagualsa became a physical manifestation of Curze's madness, its architecture and decoration reflecting the chaos within his mind. New chambers were added without regard for structural logic or practical purpose, rooms that served no function except to house additional displays of preserved victims. The Primarch personally supervised the positioning of each new body, ensuring that it contributed to the larger narrative he was constructing through the arrangement of corpses. That narrative remained comprehensible only to Curze himself, a story written in dead flesh that detailed his grievances against the Imperium, his philosophy of terror and justice, and his certainty that humanity deserved nothing but the horrors he had inflicted upon it. The Night Lords who remained on Tsagualsa, rather than departing with the independent warbands, found themselves trapped in their Primarch's nightmare, unable to leave but equally unable to understand or share his vision. They maintained the fortress and added to its decorations because that was what Curze demanded and because they had nowhere else to go. The legion that had once brought entire sectors into compliance through calculated terror had been reduced to a collection of broken warriors, maintaining a monument to their own damnation on a dead world at the edge of known space, waiting for an end that their Primarch had already seen and accepted as inevitable. The assassin arrived on Tsagualsa without ceremony or announcement, her presence undetected by the censor, arrays that the Night Lords had established across the dead world's orbit. Emshen belonged to the Calidus Temple, one of the most feared and specialized branches of the Officio Assassinorum. Her training had taken decades, her body and mind transformed through a combination of genetic manipulation, chemical enhancement, and psychological conditioning into a weapon designed for a single purpose: the elimination of targets that conventional military force could not reach. The polymorphine that flowed through her veins allowed her to alter her physical appearance at will, mimicking other humans with such precision that even biometric scanners could be fooled. Her neural conditioning had stripped away fear, doubt, and mercy, leaving only the mission parameters and the skills necessary to complete them. The orders that had sent Emshen to the Eastern Fringe came directly from the highest levels of Imperial authority, though the exact chain of command remained obscured by the operational security that surrounded all Assassinorum deployments. What was certain was that Konrad Curze had been judged guilty of crimes against the Imperium severe enough to warrant execution by one of the Emperor's own instruments of targeted killing. The destruction of Nostramo, the atrocities committed during the heresy, the continued raids against Imperial territories even after the War Master's defeat at Terra. The list of offenses was extensive enough that the decision to eliminate the Night Haunter required no additional justification beyond the simple fact that he existed as a threat to Imperial stability and security. Emshen's infiltration of Tsaguelsa demonstrated the training and capabilities that made Calidus assassins among the most effective killers in the Imperium's arsenal. She did not attempt a direct assault on the fortress complex or try to fight her way through the Night Lord's companies that occupied the Dead World. Instead, she studied the patterns of movement around the palace, identifying the supply vessels that arrived periodically with provisions and equipment. The polymorphine allowed her to assume the appearance of a servitor, one of the mindless cyborg laborers that performed menial tasks throughout the fortress. In this guise, she moved through the palace's corridors for weeks, mapping the layout and observing the routines of Curze's household, while the Night Lords around her paid no more attention to her presence than they would to any other piece of equipment. The palace's security, such as it was, proved laughably inadequate to stop a determined assassin. The Night Lords had grown complacent in their isolation, confident that no enemy would dare attack them in their own stronghold. The guards who were supposed to maintain watch over the approaches to Curze's personal chambers spent more time engaged in their own amusements than actually monitoring for threats. The sensor systems that should have detected unauthorized movement had fallen into disrepair or been cannibalized for parts by tech adepts who needed components for other projects. The labyrinthine layout that was meant to confuse intruders actually worked in Emshen's favor, providing multiple routes to her target and numerous places to hide if she needed to avoid detection. Curze knew she was coming. His visions had shown him this exact sequence of events countless times over the decades since he had first experienced the prophetic nightmare of his own death. He had seen Emshen's face, had watched through prescient sight as she moved through his palace, had witnessed the exact moment when her blade would end his existence. The knowledge did not prompt him to increase security or take precautions that might have prevented the assassination. Instead, he made a conscious decision to allow events to unfold exactly as his visions had shown him they would. He dismissed the Atramentor who normally guarded his chambers, sending them away on manufactured errands that would keep them occupied for hours. He deactivated the personal defense systems that could have killed an intruder before they reached his throne room. He removed his armor and weapons, leaving himself as vulnerable as a baseline human despite the superhuman physiology that made him vastly more dangerous than any normal person, even when unequipped. The choice to accept death rather than fight against it represented the culmination of Curze's lifelong struggle with fate and free will. His entire existence had been defined by the visions that showed him futures he could not change, events that would occur regardless of his actions or desires. He had tried to prove that his methods could create lasting change, that terror could transform human nature and build societies that would maintain order without his constant presence. Nostramo's reversion to criminality had proven that theory false. He had believed that the Imperium's hypocrisy would eventually be exposed, that the Emperor's dream would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The Horus Heresy had validated that prediction, tearing the Imperium apart in a civil war that had killed billions and left the galaxy burning. Now, in the final moments of his life, Curze sought one last validation, proof that his death at the hands of an Imperial assassin would demonstrate that the Imperium was exactly as murderous and brutal as he had always claimed it to be. Emshen found him alone in his throne room, seated upon the bone structure that served as his seat of power, surrounded by the preserved corpses that were his only companions. The assassin had shed her servitor disguise, her true form revealed as she approached her target with weapons drawn. The Khatan phase sword she carried hummed with barely contained energy, its blade capable of cutting through ceramite armor and Primarch flesh with equal ease. She moved with the fluid grace that marked all Calidus operatives, her approach silent despite the bone floor that should have made stealth impossible. Curze watched her come without moving from his throne, his gaunt face illuminated by the dim lighting that barely penetrated the chamber's shadows. The Night Haunter could have killed her easily. Even unarmed and unarmored, a Primarch possessed strength and speed that made them vastly superior to any baseline human, even one enhanced to the peak of what the Assassinorum could achieve. He could have torn Emshen apart with his bare hands before she completed her strike, could have called for his guards, and had her captured and tortured for information about who had sent her. Instead, he remained motionless as she raised her blade, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made even a trained assassin hesitate for a fraction of a second. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the throne room with the same cold certainty that had characterized his pronouncements throughout his life. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The words were not a plea or a curse, but a statement of absolute conviction. Curze believed that by dying to an Imperial assassin, by being murdered on the orders of the same Imperium that had created him, and used him to terrorize countless worlds into compliance, he was proving everything he had ever claimed about the Emperor's hypocrisy and the fundamental brutality that underlay all human civilization. The Imperium pretended to represent enlightenment and progress, claimed to be building a better future for humanity through the Great Crusade's expansion. Yet when one of the Emperor's own sons became inconvenient, when his methods became too embarrassing or his continued existence posed too many uncomfortable questions, the response was not justice or redemption, but simple murder. An assassin in the dark, a blade through the heart, an execution carried out in secret on a dead world where no one would witness it or question the necessity. Emshen's Fei's sword struck with the precision that decades of training had perfected. The blade entered Curze's chest just below the sternum, angled upward to pierce both hearts simultaneously. The energy field that surrounded the weapon's edge prevented any possibility of survival, the molecular disruption it caused ensuring that even Primarch regeneration could not repair the damage. Curze's body convulsed once as the blade destroyed organs that had sustained him for over 2 centuries, his superhuman physiology fighting against injuries that were fundamentally unsurvivable. His eyes remained fixed on Emshen's face as life left them, the expression in those dark orbs suggesting satisfaction rather than fear or regret. The Night Haunter died as he had lived, alone in darkness, surrounded by death, certain that his existence had proven the point he had spent his entire life trying to make. The assassin worked quickly once her target had expired. She produced a monomolecular wire from her equipment and used it to sever Curze's head from his body, the blade cutting through enhanced bone and muscle with minimal resistance. The head she sealed in a stasis field generator designed specifically for transporting biological samples that needed to be preserved in perfect condition. She also removed one of the ornate shoulder guards that Curze had worn, a piece of wargear known as the Corona Nox that served as both armor and symbol of office. The artifact was covered in Nostramo runes and decorated with fragments of bone and precious metals, a physical representation of the Night Lord's culture and their Primarch's reign. These trophies secured, Emshen began her extraction from the palace, reactivating her polymorphine disguise to move through the corridors as she had during her infiltration. The discovery of Curze's body came hours later when the Atrementor returned from the errands their Primarch had assigned them. The Terminators found the throne room exactly as Emshen had left it, their Gene Father's headless corpse slumped on his bone throne, surrounded by the preserved dead who had been his only companions in the final years of his life. The sight of their Primarch's decapitated body triggered responses that varied wildly among the different Night Lords who learned of the assassination. Some refused to believe it, insisting that this was another of Curze's elaborate psychological operations designed to test their loyalty or punish some perceived failure. Others accepted the death with fatalistic resignation, recognizing that their Primarch had been walking toward this end for decades and had finally reached it. A few actually felt relief that the burden of following an increasingly insane leader had been lifted, though none would admit such thoughts aloud where their brothers might hear them. The Legion's response to their Primarch's assassination was fragmented and uncoordinated, reflecting the organizational chaos that had characterized the Night Lords since the Thrama's crusade. No single captain or commander possessed the authority or the credibility to assume overall leadership of the Legion. The Atrementor, who might have served as a unifying force, found themselves divided over how to respond to Curze's death and whether they should pursue vengeance against the assassin who had killed him. Some companies immediately departed Sagualsa, their captains deciding that without their Primarch's presence, there was no reason to remain on the dead world. Others stayed, either out of genuine loyalty to Curze's memory or simply because they had nowhere else to go and no better options available to them. Emshen's escape from Sagualsa demonstrated the same skill and preparation that had characterized her infiltration. She had arranged for an extraction vessel to be positioned at a specific location on the planet's surface, far from the main fortress complex and the orbital traffic that the Night Lords monitored. The ship departed the system before most of the Legion even knew their Primarch was dead, disappearing into the warp with its precious cargo of Curze's head and the Corona Nox. The Night Lords, who eventually learned of the assassin's identity and her successful extraction, launched pursuit operations, but these efforts were half-hearted and poorly coordinated. The various warbands could not agree on whether revenge for their Primarch's death should take priority over their own agendas and survival, and the lack of unified command meant that no systematic hunt for Emshen ever materialized. The philosophical implications of Curze's death and his final words resonated differently among the various factions within the Shattered Legion. Those who had believed in their Primarch's vision saw his willing acceptance of death as the ultimate proof of his theories about fate and the Imperium's hypocrisy. Curze had predicted his own assassination, had seen it coming for decades, and had chosen not to prevent it because doing so would have invalidated his belief in the immutability of the future and the inevitability of the Imperium's moral bankruptcy. By allowing himself to be killed by an Imperial assassin, he had demonstrated that the Imperium dealt with inconvenient truths the same way it dealt with any other threat, through violence and murder dressed up as necessary action. The Emperor's justice was revealed as nothing more than expedient elimination of problems that could not be solved through conventional means. The skeptics within the Legion, primarily the remaining Terran veterans and those few Nostramans who had retained some capacity for critical thinking, saw Curze's death differently. To them, the assassination proved only that their Primarch had been insane, so consumed by his visions, and his fatalism that he had engineered his own death to validate beliefs that were fundamentally delusional. The Imperium had not killed Curze because he spoke uncomfortable truths, but because he had become a rogue element that threatened Imperial stability and continued to commit atrocities against Imperial citizens even after the heresy had ended. His death was not vindication, but simply the logical consequence of decades of crimes and the inevitable response to a threat that needed to be eliminated. That he had seen it coming and chosen not to prevent it said more about his mental state than about any philosophical truth regarding fate or Imperial hypocrisy. The Night Lords who remained on Sagualsa after their Primarch's death found themselves custodians of a monument that had lost its purpose. The palace and the fortress complex had been extensions of Curze's madness, physical manifestations of his obsessions, and his descent into complete psychological collapse. Without him to provide context and meaning to the elaborate displays of preserved corpses and the labyrinthine architecture, the structures became simply buildings filled with dead bodies, impressive in their grotesque scale, but ultimately empty of significance. Some companies maintained their territories within the complex out of habit, or because they genuinely had nowhere else to establish themselves. Others abandoned Sagualsa entirely, scattering across the eastern fringe to pursue their own wars and agendas without reference to any larger purpose or collective identity. The death of Konrad Curze shattered what little cohesion remained within the Night Lords Legion. Without their Primarch's authority, however erratic it had become in his final years, the various companies and warbands found themselves without any compelling reason to maintain even the pretense of unified command. The captains who had been chafing under Curze's increasingly unstable leadership saw his assassination as liberation rather than tragedy. They took their warriors and whatever ships they could claim, departing Sagualsa to pursue their own agendas across the galaxy. The fragmentation happened quickly, within months of the discovery of Curze's headless corpse. Companies that had fought together during the Great Crusade and the heresy dissolved their alliances and went their separate ways, each captain convinced that his approach to warfare and survival offered the best path forward for his warriors. The warbands that emerged from this dissolution varied dramatically in size, composition, and operational philosophy. Some consisted of entire companies that had maintained their structure and equipment relatively intact through the heresy and its aftermath. These larger formations possessed the fleet assets and manpower to conduct significant raids against Imperial targets, operating much as they had during the Crusade, except without any coordination with other Night Lords' elements. Captain Krieg Acerbus led one such warband, his forces numbering several hundred Astartes supported by a battle barge and multiple strike cruisers. Acerbus maintained strict discipline within his warband, enforcing standards of conduct and tactical doctrine that resembled the Legion's practices during its early years before Nostraman cultural influences had completely dominated. Other warbands formed around individual champions who had distinguished themselves through combat prowess or cunning rather than formal rank within the old Legion structure. These leaders gathered followers from the remnants of shattered companies, accepting any Night Lord who would swear loyalty regardless of their previous allegiance or history. The warbands they created tended towards smaller sizes, rarely exceeding 100 Astartes, but they compensated for limited numbers through extreme mobility and willingness to take risks that larger formations would consider unacceptable. These groups operated from single vessels or small flotillas, striking targets of opportunity and fleeing before Imperial forces could respond in strength. Talos Valkoren, who would later become known as the Soul Hunter, exemplified this type of warband leader. He had been a line warrior in the 10th Company during the Heresy, distinguished primarily by the prophetic visions he experienced that marked him as one of those who had inherited fragments of Curze's curse. After the Legion's dissolution, Talos gathered a mixed group of Night Lords from various companies who saw value in his ability to glimpse possible futures and used that knowledge to avoid disasters that would have destroyed less fortunate warbands. His forces operated from a strike cruiser called the Covenant of Blood, conducting raids across Imperial space while struggling to maintain their equipment and numbers through salvage and opportunistic recruitment. The Eye of Terror became the primary refuge for many Night Lords' warbands, though they never established the kind of permanent bases that some other traitor legions maintained within the Warp Storm. The Night Lords had always been fleet-based raiders rather than conquerors who held territory, and this preference for mobility continued after their fragmentation. They would enter the Eye to repair damaged vessels, recruit new warriors from the populations of demon worlds or renegade humans who inhabited the region, and trade with other traitor Legion elements for equipment and supplies they could not manufacture or steal themselves. Then they would depart on new raids, emerging from the warp at locations across the Imperium to strike at targets that offered plunder, slaves, or simply opportunities to inflict terror on Imperial populations. The Maelstrom served a similar function for warbands operating in the Ultima Segmentum and the Eastern Fringe. This second Great Warp Storm provided another region where Imperial authority held no sway and where traitor Astartes could operate without constant threat of retaliation. The Night Lords who based themselves in the Maelstrom tended to be those who had operated in the Eastern Fringe during the Heresy and saw no reason to travel across the galaxy to join their brothers in the Eye of Terror. They raided the densely populated worlds of Ultramar and the surrounding sectors, their attacks motivated by the same mixture of material need and psychological compulsion that drove their counterparts operating from the Eye. The evolution of the Night Lords into pirates and raiders was not a conscious strategic choice, but rather the inevitable result of their circumstances and nature. They possessed no territory to defend, no population base to draw recruits from after Nostramo's destruction, no industrial capacity to manufacture the equipment and supplies necessary to maintain their forces. Everything they needed had to be taken from others, whether through raids against Imperial targets or through deals with other Chaos-aligned forces. This existence as perpetual raiders shaped how the warbands organized themselves and what targets they prioritized. Worlds with significant industrial output or large populations became preferred targets because they offered the greatest potential for acquiring useful resources. Isolated outposts and lightly defended systems attracted attention because they could be hit quickly with minimal risk of encountering resistance, capable of inflicting serious casualties. The terror tactics that had defined the Legion during the Great Crusade remained central to how Night Lords' warbands operated, though the purpose behind these methods had shifted significantly. During the Crusade, the Night Lords had employed terror to achieve compliance and bring worlds into the Imperium with minimal resource expenditure. The atrocities they committed served strategic goals, however morally questionable those goals might have been. After the Legion's fragmentation, terror became an end in itself rather than a means to an end. Warbands would descend upon Imperial worlds not to conquer them or extract specific resources, but simply to terrorize the population and demonstrate that the Imperium could not protect its citizens from the monsters that lurked in the darkness between the stars. These raids followed patterns that had been refined over centuries of practice. A warband would identify a target through intelligence gathering, often spending months observing a system to determine defensive strength, population distribution, and potential complications that might interfere with a successful strike. The attack itself would come suddenly, with the warband's vessels emerging from the warp at the system's edge and burning toward their target at maximum speed. The initial assault focused on eliminating orbital defenses and achieving rapid deployment to the surface, accepting casualties that other forces would consider excessive in exchange for the shock value of an immediate ground presence. Once on the surface, Night Lord's forces would disperse into the population centers, their objectives focused on maximizing terror rather than holding territory or destroying military assets. Small teams of Astartes would hunt through cities and settlements, killing with calculated brutality designed to create the greatest possible psychological impact. Civilians would be flayed alive in public squares, their screams broadcast across all available communication channels. Planetary defense force units would be ambushed and slaughtered, their bodies arranged in elaborate displays that demonstrated the futility of resistance. Local authorities would be hunted down and executed in ways that ensured their deaths became public knowledge, destroying any sense that leadership could provide protection or coordination. The raids typically lasted only days or weeks before the warband withdrew, their vessels departing the system before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. The goal was never to hold the conquered territory, but to inflict maximum psychological damage and acquire whatever resources could be taken in the limited time available. Slaves represented particularly valuable plunder, as they could be sold to other Chaos forces or used to supplement the warband's own mortal auxiliaries. Equipment and supplies were stripped from military installations and industrial facilities. Gene seed was harvested from any loyalist Astartes killed during the fighting, as the Night Lord's own gene stocks remained relatively stable and could be used to create new warriors when suitable candidates were available. The lack of coordination between different Night Lords' warbands meant that these raids occurred without any overarching strategy or purpose beyond the immediate goals of the individual groups conducting them. A dozen different warbands might operate within the same sector without ever communicating with each other or coordinating their attacks to achieve larger strategic effects. This fragmentation actually served the Night Lords well in some respects, as it made them difficult for Imperial forces to predict or counter effectively. There was no central leadership to decapitate, no supply lines to interdict, no territory to reclaim. Each warband operated independently, striking when and where opportunity presented itself, then disappearing back into the void before retaliation could be organized. The development of unique characteristics within individual warbands reflected both the personalities of their leaders and the specific circumstances of their operations. Some warbands maintained traditions and practices from their original companies within the old Legion structure, preserving elements of unit identity that predated the fragmentation. Others adopted new symbols, rituals, and methods that distinguished them from their brothers and created distinct identities. The Bleeding Eyes Warband, led by a champion named Betrayal, specialized in targeting Adeptus Astartes recruitment worlds, their raids designed to kill potential Space Marine candidates before they could be transformed into loyalist warriors. The Screaming Gallery, commanded by a former apothecary who had descended into complete madness, collected the preserved heads of their victims and displayed them throughout their vessel in arrangements that supposedly held prophetic significance. Fleet assets became the most critical resource for maintaining warband viability, as without ships, a group of Night Lords could neither conduct raids nor escape Imperial retaliation. The vessels that individual warbands controlled varied dramatically in size and condition. Some possessed ancient warships that dated back to the Great Crusade, their machine spirits corrupted by millennia of service to chaos, but still functional enough to carry warriors into battle. Others operated captured Imperial vessels or ships acquired through trade with other trader forces, these craft often bearing modifications and repairs that made them barely recognizable as their original patterns. The largest warbands might control multiple capital ships and supporting escorts, allowing them to conduct fleet actions against Imperial Navy elements or rival chaos forces. Smaller groups made do with single vessels, often strike cruisers or frigates that provided just enough transport capacity and firepower to conduct limited raids. Recruitment methods for replacing casualties and expanding warband strength presented constant challenges given the Night Lords' lack of a stable population base. Some warbands recruited from the populations of worlds within the Eye of Terror, or the Maelstrom, taking young males who showed appropriate levels of aggression and sociopathy. These recruits underwent the gene seed implantation process aboard the warband's vessels, the procedures conducted by apothecaries who worked with equipment that was often centuries old and barely functional. The success rate for these transformations was significantly lower than what the Legion had achieved during the Great Crusade, with many aspirants dying during the implantation process or emerging as failed creations that had to be destroyed. Those who survived became full battle brothers, though they often lacked the training and indoctrination that had characterized Legion recruitment during its organized period. Other warbands took a more predatory approach to recruitment, raiding Imperial worlds specifically to capture suitable candidates who could be forcibly transformed into Night Lords. These kidnapped youths were subjected to the gene seed implantation process, whether they consented or not. The apothecaries who performed the procedures caring nothing for the psychological trauma inflicted on their unwilling subjects. The warriors created through this method often proved unstable and difficult to control, their forced transformation leaving psychological scars that manifested as even more extreme brutality and sadism than was typical for Night Lords. Some warbands considered this a feature rather than a bug, valuing the uncontrolled violence these warriors brought to combat operations. The Night Lords' continued resistance to chaos worship distinguished them from most other traitor legions and created both advantages and complications for their long-term survival. Unlike the World Eaters who had given themselves entirely to Khorne or the Thousand Suns who served Tzeentch, the Night Lords maintained their secular brutality. They did not pray to the Chaos Gods or seek demonic patronage. They viewed the ruinous powers with the same contempt they directed at the Imperium, seeing them as just another set of tyrants demanding worship and obedience. This resistance to corruption meant that Night Lords' warbands remained relatively free from the mutations and instabilities that plagued other traitor forces. Their gene seed stayed stable across generations of implantation, producing warriors who were physiologically similar to loyalist Astartes despite their psychological differences and moral degradation. This stability came with costs. Warbands that refused to embrace chaos found themselves at a disadvantage when fighting against enemies who wielded demonic power or benefited from the gifts of the dark gods. The blessings that transformed other traitor Astartes into superhuman monsters, beyond even the enhanced capabilities of standard space marines, remained unavailable to Night Lords who rejected such patronage. They fought with the same strength and speed they had possessed as loyalist warriors, enhanced only by their experience and the terror tactics they employed rather than by supernatural augmentation. This meant that in direct combat against heavily corrupted enemies or demon-enhanced champions, Night Lords often found themselves outmatched in raw power, even if their tactical sophistication remained superior. Some warbands adopted a pragmatic approach to this limitation, using demonic allies when tactical situations demanded supernatural support while maintaining their refusal to worship the entities they summoned. These groups would bind demons through sorceress contracts negotiated with chaos sorcerers from other legions, employing the warp entities as disposable shock troops or specialized assets for particular operations. The demons served because they were compelled to do so through binding rituals, rather than because the Night Lords worshipped them or offered genuine devotion. This arrangement satisfied neither party particularly well, but provided functional cooperation when circumstances required it. The Night Lords got access to supernatural capabilities they could not generate themselves, while the demons gained opportunities to manifest in real space and inflict suffering on mortal populations, even if their summoners showed them no respect or reverence. The relationship between different Night Lords warbands ranged from cooperative to openly hostile depending on circumstances and the personalities of the leaders involved. Some champions maintained cordial relations with their former brothers, willing to share intelligence about Imperial fleet movements or coordinate raids when doing so offered mutual benefit. These alliances remained temporary and transactional, based on immediate practical considerations rather than any sense of loyalty or shared purpose. A warband might cooperate with another for a specific operation, then refuse all contact for years afterward if their paths did not cross or their interests did not align. Other warbands viewed their fellow Night Lords as competitors for resources and opportunities, their interactions characterized by suspicion and occasional violence when territorial disputes or personal grudges erupted into open conflict. The prophetic visions that afflicted certain Night Lords continued to influence warband operations and decision-making, though the reliability and clarity of these visions varied dramatically between individuals. Some seers experienced glimpses of the future that proved accurate enough to provide genuine tactical advantages, warning their warbands of ambushes or revealing weaknesses in enemy defenses that could be exploited. Others received fragmentary images that required interpretation and often proved misleading or completely wrong when events actually unfolded. The psychological cost of these visions remained severe regardless of their accuracy. Night Lords cursed with prophetic sight often descended into the same madness that had consumed their Primarch, their minds breaking under the weight of futures they could not prevent or change. Warbands led by visionaries tended toward fatalism and nihilism, even beyond the baseline darkness that characterized all Night Lords, their members convinced that their actions mattered little because fate had already determined all outcomes. The 10,000 years since the heresy had transformed the Night Lords from a unified legion into a constellation of independent warbands, connected only by shared gene seed and common cultural practices inherited from their Nostraman origins. They remained hunters in the darkness, predators who struck from the void to terrorize Imperial populations and demonstrate that the Emperor's protection extended only as far as his fleets could reach. But they hunted without purpose beyond the immediate satisfaction of inflicting fear and acquiring resources necessary for survival. The grand vision that Curze had articulated, however twisted it had been, no longer guided their actions. They were simply killers perpetuating violence across the galaxy because killing was what they knew how to do, and because the alternative was accepting their own obsolescence and irrelevance in a galaxy that had moved beyond the ideological conflicts that had birthed them. The Night Lords who stalked the darkness of the 41st millennium bear little resemblance to the organized legion that once brought entire sectors into compliance during the Great Crusade. The 10,000 years since their Primarch's assassination have transformed them into something simultaneously more and less than what they were. The warbands that carry the Midnight Blue and Lightning Bolt heraldry operate as independent raiders scattered across the galaxy, united only by shared gene seed and the cultural practices inherited from Nostramo's criminal underworld. They maintain no central command structure, acknowledge no supreme leader who could claim Curze's mantle, and pursue no collective strategic objectives beyond survival and the infliction of terror on Imperial populations. Each warband charts its own course through the galaxy, striking where opportunity presents itself and fleeing before Imperial retaliation can materialize. The Eye of Terror hosts the largest concentration of Night Lord's forces, though even there they refuse to establish the kind of permanent fortifications that other traitor legions maintain. The warbands drift through the Warp Storm's demon-infested regions, using corrupted worlds as temporary bases while they repair damaged vessels and replenish their ranks. The demon world of Tsagualsa, where Curze died, remains abandoned except for occasional pilgrimages by warbands seeking to witness the ruins of their Primarch's palace. Most Night Lords view the dead world with a mixture of reverence and disgust, recognizing it as the physical manifestation of everything their legion became, but finding no value in maintaining a presence there. The palace itself has fallen into greater ruin over the millennia, its elaborate displays of preserved corpses long since decayed to dust, leaving only the architecture as testament to Curze's madness. The Maelstrom serves similar functions for warbands operating in the Ultima Segmentum and the Eastern Fringe. These groups maintain a presence in the Warp Storm's outer reaches, conducting raids against the densely populated worlds of Ultramar and the surrounding sectors before retreating to the relative safety of the Storm's embrace. The Night Lords who base themselves in the Maelstrom have developed a particular hatred for the Ultramarines and their successor chapters, viewing them as representatives of everything hypocritical about the Imperium. The Sons of Guilliman preach order and civilization, while their realm was built on conquest and forced compliance, the same methods the Night Lords employed, but without the honest brutality that characterized the 8th Legion's approach. Raids against Ultramar territories carry an edge of ideological vindication beyond simple material gain, each successful strike proving that the Imperium's model worlds remain vulnerable to those willing to embrace the darkness. The scattered nature of Night Lords' operations makes estimating their total numbers difficult, but the best intelligence suggests that perhaps 15 to 20,000 Astartes carry the 8th Legion's gene seed across the galaxy. This represents a significant decline from the Legion's strength during the Heresy, when they could field perhaps 80,000 warriors despite the losses suffered during the Thrama's crusade. The attrition of 10 millennia has reduced their numbers through combat casualties, failed recruitments, and the simple entropy that affects all traitor Legion forces operating without the support infrastructure that the Imperium provides to loyalist chapters. Some warbands have grown extinct entirely, their last warriors killed in raids that went catastrophically wrong or consumed by the warp during transit between systems. Others have merged with different warbands or been absorbed by larger groups after suffering losses that left them unable to maintain independent operations. The philosophical legacy of Konrad Curze remains the subject of constant debate and reinterpretation among the scattered warbands, each group developing its own understanding of what their Primarch's life and death meant. Some warbands embrace Curze's fatalism completely, viewing themselves as instruments of inevitable doom, whose actions are predetermined by fate. These groups operate with a nihilistic certainty that borders on religious conviction, believing that their raids and atrocities serve purposes beyond their understanding, but which contribute to the galaxy's eventual descent into complete darkness. They see their Primarch's willing acceptance of death as the ultimate proof that free will is an illusion, and that all beings are simply playing out roles assigned to them by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Other warbands reject this interpretation, arguing that Curze's fatalism was simply a manifestation of his madness rather than genuine philosophical insight. These groups maintain that the Night Lord's purpose lies not in fulfilling some predetermined destiny, but in demonstrating the fundamental brutality that underlies all human civilization. They view terror as an honest form of governance, one that strips away the comfortable lies that allow populations to believe they are safe or that authority exists for their benefit. Their raids serve as education through violence, teaching Imperial citizens that the Emperor's protection is conditional and limited, that order exists only where force can be projected to maintain it. This interpretation preserves elements of Curze's original vision, while rejecting the paralyzing fatalism that consumed him in his final years. A third faction within the Scattered Legion has abandoned any pretense of philosophical justification for their actions, embracing pure nihilism without the framework of fate or purpose that characterized their Primarch's worldview. These warbands commit atrocities because they enjoy inflicting suffering, because the screams of their victims provide satisfaction that nothing else in their long existence can match. They are killers who have forgotten why they kill, predators who hunt because predation is their nature rather than because it serves any larger goal. This group represents the majority of Night Lord's forces in the 41st millennium, warriors who have spent centuries or even millennia conducting raids without meaningful purpose beyond immediate survival and the gratification of their darkest impulses. The question of vindication versus damnation haunts those Night Lords capable of contemplating their legion's legacy with any degree of introspection. Curze believed that his death at the hands of an Imperial assassin proved the Imperium's hypocrisy and validated his philosophy of terror as honest governance. 10,000 years later, the evidence supporting this interpretation remains ambiguous at best. The Imperium survived the heresy and continues to function despite its obvious flaws and contradictions. The Emperor's vision, however corrupted and diminished, still provides framework and purpose for billions of humans across the galaxy. The Night Lords, in contrast, have devolved into pirates and raiders whose actions serve no purpose beyond perpetuating their own existence and inflicting suffering on populations that have no memory of why the 8th Legion turned traitor in the first place. Some warbands seek purpose beyond simple survival and violence, attempting to find meaning in their existence as outcasts and traitors. These groups conduct their raids with specific objectives in mind, targeting Imperial institutions or infrastructure that represents the hypocrisy Curze identified in the Imperium's foundations. They strike at ecclesiarchy facilities, destroying temples and executing priests who preach the Emperor's divinity while the Imperium commits atrocities in his name. They raid administratum centers, slaughtering bureaucrats who enforce regulations that crush populations beneath layers of taxation and conscription. They hunt inquisitors and arbites judges, killing those who claim to dispense justice while operating above any law except their own authority. These operations provide a sense that their violence serves purposes beyond mere destruction, that they continue their Primarch's work of exposing the Imperium's fundamental corruption. The fate of First Captain Sevatar remains one of the great mysteries surrounding the Night Lord's history. The warrior who had been Curze's right hand and one of the few officers capable of maintaining discipline within the Legion disappeared during the later stages of the Thrama's crusade under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Some accounts claim he was captured by the Dark Angels and imprisoned aboard one of their vessels, only to escape during a warp transit and vanish into the immaterium. Others suggest he led a contingent of Night Lords on a mission that took them deep into uncharted regions of the galaxy, never to return. A few whispered legends among the warbands claim that Sevatar still lives, leading a warband that operates in complete secrecy and strikes only at targets that serve some larger strategy comprehensible only to him. The truth remains unknown, but the absence of the Prince of Crows left a void in the Legion's leadership that was never filled and contributed significantly to the fragmentation that followed Curze's death. Talos Valcorin, known as the Soul Hunter, became one of the most notable Night Lords in the millennia following the heresy. His prophetic visions, inherited from his Primarch's curse, gave him insights that allowed his warband to survive situations that would have destroyed less fortunate groups. Talos led the 10th Company's remnants through countless raids across Imperial space, struggling to maintain their equipment and numbers, while grappling with the question of what purpose the Night Lords served in a galaxy that had moved beyond the ideological conflicts that birthed them. His warband operated from the strike cruiser Covenant of Blood, a vessel that bore the scars of centuries of combat and barely functional systems held together through improvisation and salvaged components. Talos himself wrestled with the legacy of Curze's fatalism, seeking to find meaning in the Night Lord's existence beyond simple violence, while recognizing that their actions served no greater purpose than survival. He was eventually killed in action during a raid against an Imperial facility, his death coming not through some prophetic inevitability, but through the simple mathematics of combat and the fact that even Astartes can only survive so many battles before their luck runs out. Other champions have risen to prominence within individual warbands, each carrying forward different interpretations of what it means to be a Night Lord in the 41st millennium. Krieg Acerbus maintains one of the largest and most disciplined warbands, his forces numbering several hundred Astartes supported by a battle barge and multiple escorts. Acerbus enforces standards of conduct and tactical doctrine that resemble the Legion's practices during the Great Crusade, before Nostramo and cultural influences completely dominated. His warriors conduct their raids with precision and purpose, targeting specific objectives rather than simply terrorizing populations for its own sake. The Exalted, a champion whose true name has been lost to time, leads a warband that has embraced the visions and prophecies that plague certain Night Lords, operating according to interpretations of futures glimpsed in nightmares and waking visions. Varjoran commands a fleet-based warband that specializes in void warfare, his forces striking at Imperial Navy assets and merchant convoys rather than conducting planetary raids. The Night Lord's role in the broader conflicts that rack the 41st millennium remains opportunistic and largely self-interested. They participate in Black Crusades when doing so offers opportunities for plunder, or when refusing would make them targets for other Chaos forces, but they maintain no loyalty to the War Master or the Chaos gods that would compel their participation. During Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, several Night Lords warbands joined the assault on Cadia, their forces contributing to the terror campaigns that preceded the final assault on the Fortress World. They fought alongside other traitor Legion elements not out of any belief in Abaddon's goals, but because the Black Crusade provided cover for their own raids, and because refusing to participate would have marked them as enemies of the War Master's coalition. When Cadia fell and the Great Rift tore across the galaxy, the Night Lords adapted to the new strategic situation with the same opportunism that has characterized their operations for millennia, exploiting the chaos and disruption to conduct raids that would have been impossible in more stable times. The conflicts between Night Lords warbands and Loyalist chapters continue with particular intensity when the Dark Angels or their successors are involved. The animosity between the two legions, born during the Thrama's crusade and intensified by the personal hatred between Curze and Lionel Johnson, has survived 10,000 years and shows no signs of diminishing. Dark Angel's successor chapters pursue Night Lords warbands with determination that exceeds normal operations against Chaos forces, their hunt driven by institutional memory of the 3-year campaign that devastated both legions. The Night Lords respond with equal viciousness, targeting Dark Angel's recruitment worlds and chapter facilities when opportunities present themselves. These conflicts carry an edge of personal vendetta that transcends the broader war between the Imperium and Chaos, both sides viewing their encounters as continuation of a war that began during the Heresy and will only end when one side or the other is completely destroyed. The Night Lord's reputation, as among the Imperium's most feared traitors, remains well-earned in the 41st millennium. Imperial populations that hear the 8th Legion is operating in their sector experience terror that goes beyond rational fear of military threat. The stories of what the Night Lords do to captured populations have spread across the Imperium over 10 millennia, growing in the telling until the reality can barely match the legend. Planetary governors who learn that Night Lords have been detected in their system sometimes order immediate evacuations of major population centers, accepting the economic and social disruption as preferable to what will happen if the traitors reach the surface. Defense force commanders who face Night Lords attacks find their troops breaking and fleeing before the first shots are fired, the psychological impact of facing the midnight-clad killers overwhelming training and discipline. The mere threat of Night Lord's attention can bring rebellious systems back into compliance, Imperial authorities exploiting the 8th Legion's reputation to achieve through fear what they could not accomplish through conventional military force. The enduring legacy of the Night Lords lies not in their military achievements or their contribution to the Chaos War effort, but in their demonstration of terror's power as a weapon and a philosophy. They have proven that fear can be as effective as faith or loyalty in maintaining control over populations, that brutality honestly applied can achieve results that more sophisticated methods cannot match. They have also demonstrated the costs of embracing terror as a primary tool of governance and warfare. The Night Lords of the 41st millennium are broken creatures, their humanity eroded by millennia of committing atrocities until they have become the monsters they were created to punish. They perpetuate violence across the galaxy not because it serves any purpose, but because violence is all they know, because the capacity for anything else was stripped away by centuries of terror campaigns and the cultural poison inherited from Nostramo's criminal underworld. Konrad Curze's final words, that death is nothing compared to vindication, echo through the millennia in the actions of his scattered sons. Whether the Night Haunter was vindicated by his death or simply proven mad remains a question without definitive answer. The Imperium continues despite its flaws, suggesting that Curze's philosophy was wrong and that human civilization can survive even when built on foundations of hypocrisy and necessary evil. Yet the Night Lords endure as well, their existence a constant reminder that the Imperium's claims of righteousness and protection are conditional and limited, that darkness waits beyond the reach of the Emperor's light to consume those who stray too far from his protection. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the Night Lords remain what they have always been, hunters in the darkness, killers without purpose or redemption, the Emperor's most honest and most damned sons.